Hello everyone, Leaf Reed here, and today is a very special day. Today I wanted to review a book with you that is definitely quite lengthy and is actually a compilation of many books. And I've wanted to do this for a while because as I've been reading it, I've had different perspectives, different changes and epiphanies on it. But today I want to take you on the journey through the Bible. And this Bible here is, I think, a third or fourth generation Bible that's been in my family from my great-grandfather, our grandfather, and it's just been, a very interesting experience for sure. And I would say I didn't come directly to the Bible as a religious text. The background to this is that I really kind of fell out of it in high school, late high school, and by the end of university I kind of came back into it. And because of this channel and the other things I was reading from a literary perspective, I kind of came back to it as a work of, fiction and mythology, and with the mindset that, I don't have to take this seriously and simply look at it from a secular point of view, more or less, and look into it as a work of literature. And the main motivation for this really was that one of the things I really read out of high school was Dante's Inferno, and that was because once I kind of, I was raised Scottish Presbyterian, no, not really, very loosely Christian, and then I went to a Catholic high school, which again was, somewhat serious, but it's never had a big part in my life. And, it's something where actually reading it, or rather falling out of my faith, so to speak, or whatever you want to call it, it's funny, the catalyst actually happened in religion class where we were going through the 10 curses of Moses on the Egyptians. And I just thought, some of these I could believe, like the water turning red because of a certain algae that scientists discovered. There's an article, the possibility of frogs and locusts coming out of their natural habitats. Yeah, that's all natural stuff. But then there are other things like, the fact it was hailing, that there was hail in Egypt, the fact that there were, the angel of death killing every firstborn. There were just a lot of things in that story that I just said, I can't believe this actually happened. Like, I literally can't believe this. It sounds too ridiculous, too silly to really take it seriously. And I just thought, well, if I can't absorb this part, which is, it's not the New Testament, but it's, part of the Old Testament, then I just can't accept any of it. And I kind of just walked away from it, and I just said, I don't want anything to do with it. It's definitely part of, the atheist movement, or, one of those new atheists. And so it's funny because as soon as I had that thing of disbelief, it enabled me to actually read things like Dante's Inferno, because I mean, the Inferno and the Divine Comedy, rather, has always existed in a place in between. Yeah, this is a work of fiction, but also it's very tightly, it's almost like pseudo meta fiction where it's non-canon, but it's so good it could be canon kind of thing. When you have a spin-off that's so good it could be considered whatever. And to that effect, I was more enamored by Dante's work because it's very upfront. It says, you don't have to believe any of this. This is literally my musings and my systematic take on the layers of hell, heaven, and purgatory. And so that kind of intellectual creative freedom, I thought, this is really cool. This is just someone's headcanon that is so intricate and so complex that you are allowed to just kind of, play with it, so to speak. And despite it being, non-canon, it appears in video games, movies. It's a seed of Western Christian literature that is so influential. You will find it everywhere. And so after going through different other books and researching other things, it was part of, I guess, the Western tradition, part of the Western canon, that you would you would know Latin, you would know a little bit of Greek, and you would know the Odyssey, the Iliad, and the Bible. And there's this kind of mixture of Greek and Christian ideas that are always part of the, what you would call the intellectual consensus that just evolved during, not really I'd say during the Renaissance. There was a new introduction of Greek thought, but the combination of these two things was so organic, you could say, that they really became inseparable. And so there were all these references and nuances, not only in the comedy, but also in like Goethe's work with Mephistopheles and Faust, that, oh right, this is referencing other Christian things. And so at a certain point, I just couldn't really take it anymore, that I was constantly left out of the loop, that I just said, look, I just have to read this now. And I think what also really catalyzed me is that people brought up certain aspects or certain things about certain Bible passages that I had heard a million times before, but recontextualized in an entirely opposite, even paradoxical manner, that I just thought, there's no way it actually says this. And until you sit down and read it, it actually says that. And you realize that the interpretation can shift. And I mean, this is the entire reason why we have the Reformation, is that the ability for lay people to read this text and reinterpret it, or interpret it in the way that makes sense to them, especially the whole idea that you're cutting out the middleman, which is the church, to salvation, that you didn't need the church and a priest, and back then they were very predatory financially with how they ran things. It just was about the individual and the self-regulation of the interpretation of Scripture, and the fact that many people died and fought for this right to have these texts is, I think, so important that I feel like I need to share my biblical journey with you guys, and as it's changed me as a person. The two other historical figures I'd bring up just before I dive into this are the Venerable Bede, who is actually from my ancestors' home of the parish of Jarrow in Newcastle upon Tyne. And it's there where they have a museum about him. And Bede was a very interesting guy for a 7th century monk, priest, and scholar. He essentially was commissioned, this is crazy, he was commissioned by the early Roman Church to do one of the 3 Latin Vulgate transcriptions. There were essentially 3 main copies that were essentially commissioned by the Vatican, and along with Bede in England and 2 others, I think one in Rome probably, and another one maybe somewhere else in Spain or Germany, I don't know. They were part of this big commission to copy down the Latin Vulgate and you know, paraphrase it and set it off. And so in the course of that, one of Bede's biggest gifts or missions and programs is that he did a whole series of books and lectures and studies kind of breaking down the Bible into digestible, readable formats for lay people. And so he just took this very complex work, broke it down, and gave it to the average person. And I know that's kind of like what I try to do with this channel all the time. I tackle these great pieces of literature and I try to at least give my take on it and enable others to receive that information and that wisdom and you know, see how that meshes with their interpretation. And it's funny how I've seen people who have read different things. It's like a book or a game or a movie where I'll see something and I have a wildly different thought than someone else who watches the same thing. I'm not Rotten Tomatoes. I always have some weird take. So there's that point. The second point I would also point out, and this is just the weirdest, craziest one of all, is a quote by Napoleon, of all people. Napoleon was, I'm pretty sure, an atheist, a champion of human rights, the conqueror, and sometimes called the devil of Europe, and, the most influential political, historical figure, maybe of all time, but certainly of recent European history. And his quote, apparently, from his perspective, is that the Bible is a living thing. And what I take that to mean is that every time you open it up, every time you look at it, every time you read it and reread it, there's something about the words, something about the passages that might speak to you directly or might change. And that quote came true when I saw people taking the exact same passage and having wildly different interpretations of it. And you could say that's just over-intellectualization, it's just, over-studying something and trying to force another interpretation into it. But I've experienced this myself where I've read something once and a few years later, and they've meant very different things. So, with that being said, I'd like to dive into the very first book of the Holy Bible, which is Genesis. And I'm planning to make this a series as I go through each book. So that was a little preamble, and now we'll kind of get into it. Now, Genesis itself is very, very long. And I guess for people who are considering what they should do if they want to get into actually reading this book, my old religion teacher once said, do not read the Bible like a book from first page to last page, because you'll never make it through. And I somewhat agree. I can only make one big distinction, that the Bible is many books with two sections, which is that the Old and the New Testament. And so the Old Testament, I think it's important to read Genesis for context and a lot of basic lore and mythology and things like that. But at the same time, it's not really the main focus for practicing religious people, because I think there is this misunderstanding that, the main basic misunderstanding is the Bible is a series of rules. Well, it was. Back in the time of the books of Exodus and the Law of Moses, where God just wrote down what to do. The entire point of the New Testament, however, is that Jesus comes as the spirit of the law. And the entire story of the New Testament and the Gospels is Jesus reinterpreting the point of the law. The most fundamental example I can give you right here is that they chastise him, the Pharisees, for doing work on a Sunday. And the work he does is healing the sick. And he comes back at them and says, right, the Lord rested on the last day, therefore we shall do no work. But if a man's donkey is in the ground, what shall he do? Shall he leave the donkey? It's like, no, he's going to do the logical, practical thing and help the animal. And that's the other big thing, is that I think in order to really approach the Bible from an ex-atheist and intellectual point of view and have a really good interpretation of it, this one weird trick that you need to keep in mind is that the New Testament is written in Greek. And that is so important, because when you recontextualize everything in the Greek language that it was originally written in, there's a lot of things that make a lot more sense. For example, one of them being the concept of sin. It's funny that even though sin was translated correctly or as accurately as possible in the King James Version, which is this one, by the way, sin always has had a connotation of something akin to debt, that there's something that is on your shoulders, it's a weight atop of you, and it's something you need to pay off, or something that is like an imbalanced scale. The original, Greek word for sin, I forget what it is, but it essentially means, it was the word derived from when you're doing archery and you miss the target. It's missing the mark. It's like you were too far left, too far right, up, down, whatever. and you just need to adjust yourself, which is much more forgiving than the English, Protestant concept of debt and money laundering and whatever. The other thing that really kind of moved me and said is that, it says in the beginning, this is John, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was God. And that's a whole thing you could decompile, but I'll do that later. In the Greek, the word is literally logos, logic. And so in this recontextualization, because the whole atheist paradigm was that logic, reason, rational thought was the apex of reality. The truth was the apex. And there are some ways that in the Bible that's still true, that truth and logos is still the pursuit. But like right here, it's almost like taunting all the atheists. It's saying that God itself, himself, whatever, is logic in the Platonic, non-tangible, metaphysical form, that the God of logic is the God of the Bible, more or less. Another way to reinterpret this after playing Xenogears is that God is, at the beginning of everything, at the beginning of time, is pure consciousness, pure ego, if you will. No. Because the very essence that creates the world, if the world was created by anything, it's kind of thought that it was thought into existence. And the only thing that makes sense is that there was a consciousness that designed it. So when it talks about the beginning, in the beginning there was light, and then God's face went upon the waters. And already beginning there, I think the biggest thing that people have to take away from this book is that, someone was telling me, do you take it word for word? As in, do I take it literally? And the answer is, there's no way to take it literally. Because again, the Old Testament is about the literal, so the Old Testament is about the literal interpretation, and the New Testament is about the spirit of that interpretation. It's literally the entire idea or concept of having a metaphor that constantly, Christ will give parables. He'll say things that literally don't make a lot of sense about animals and gardens and gates and keys. And his disciples are always asking him, his disciples who spend all their time with him are like, what are you talking about? And then he has to explain to them. And so the entire idea of a non-physical, non-literal, but metaphorical, metaphysical, spiritual, otherworldly essence that permeates human nature is the whole point. So you can always take, and you always should take, a metaphorical interpretation to everything, because it can be read metaphorically, and you can reread the Old Testament metaphorically, and it has weird similarities and things that line up with the New Testament. And that's kind of the baseline of point. And the ultimate point is that while logos, God, logic, and truth are supreme, let's say, the New Testament is really about the science and magic of love, and how love holds a co-standardship with truth in the infinitely united oneness. Another way to explain this simply is that, imagine taking the most complicated thought possible, or the most emotional feeling possible. Think about the time when you've been brain blasted, or the time when you've had an overwhelming emotion that, it destroys your whole body, or, sends you into, a crying fit or something, or an intellectual mind blast. the idea of God is that it's the intertwining of those two concepts of ultimate truth and ultimate love in a kind of Hegelian dialectic where they're combining into a singular experience that is the extent of what your physical and mental body can take. The most extreme thought, the most complex thought, the most intense emotion. And it takes that and turns it into an understandable parable for humans to understand. But to wrap that up, I think when you take on the Bible, I think you can read Genesis, and you should read Genesis, but it really does lead into Exodus, and it only really gets bogged down in Leviticus, where they're giving the laws and the things and the censuses and the numbers. It's all rather quite boring, to be honest. So some people are very much tempted to start with Matthew, which is the first book of the New Testament, because, you know, Christianity is based on this guy called Christ, not, and all the other stuff is good context, but the real meat of the ideas and the ideas of the religion are all contained in 4 very small books that are all retelling the exact same story. And so a lot of people will go to Matthew, and Matthew is good with one caveat, that the kind of opening or the beginning of that book is a genealogy of Jesus, or of Joseph rather, Jesus' father, and it's just not very interesting. It's not very good. So I would just like suggest, you know, I would read a bit of Genesis. Maybe I would try to read all of Genesis, and then with the New Testament, I would start with Matthew and literally just skip that whole first chapter. If you want a more, I don't know, robust thing, I might also start with John. That would be my second recommendation. And then from there, you just kind of read book after book. I mean, that's the way I went about it, and it was very kind of, you know, tedious, I'll admit, but it was something that I appreciated doing because it did have a flow from book to book. Right, this happens, and this happens, and this happens. But there are some points where it's just a bunch of historical data, really. I mean, what people don't understand as well, I think, is that the Bible's also a historical book. It mentions, you know, I mean, it's in the Apocrypha, but like people like Alexander the Great. Outside of that, they actually mention Darius. They mention Xerxes of Persia. You know, they mention Caesar, obviously. So, you know, a lot of people like to say, well, did Jesus really exist? Well, if you're going to question Jesus, you also have to question all these other guys, I guess, who also appear throughout ancient history. The Pharaoh, obviously, Ramesses, who they don't actually, I don't think they actually name him, but that's kind of like later in Chronicles where they retroactively say the Pharaoh's name. But anyway, I digress. So with all that being said, let's go into Genesis. So I'll just read you the first line here. And again, this is going to be from a very secular literary perspective. So I'm not going to be sermoning or preaching. This is simply a intellectual just interpretation and kind of like a summary, really, of the book. So I'll just read the first part here because this is the beginning. So the first book of Moses, called Genesis, Greek for beginning. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And the evening and the morning were the first day. So that's kind of the opening line right there. And so with Genesis, it's just a creation story about the 7 days that God takes to create everything in existence, basically. I think it's interesting that people, will take this literally and say, well, it's literally 7 days. Well, if our whatever calculations about the universe are correct, it was obviously more of that. And I've never had an issue with reinterpreting what these words mean to be much longer than that, to really create all the animals, man, and the land masses and all of that. I guess the funny thing about Genesis is that he says here in the first day he's making night and day, yet at the same time he doesn't create the sun and the moon until like the fourth day. And that was always something very weird to me. The way he describes it, or the way it's described here, is that these were essentially created to divide the day from the night. So day and night existed, but they couldn't be identified without the sun and the moon, which kind of makes sense in a way, because without, just the stars or void or whatever, you would have no night or day, or there would, at least not to us. Again, another thing I like to think about, if this creator, is real, then he would not be confined to the three-dimensional world, and he'd be able to, peer into things. He'd be able to appear into space and time. And that's one thing that has always been kind of a head-turning thing, the idea of someone being outside of time and being able to observe it. And this is where a lot of arguments I've gotten into, or discussions around Protestant, Calvinist predestination, which is something I don't really believe, but the only way I've come to understand it is that it also makes no sense, because if you're an observer outside of time and you've pre-elected certain people to do the right thing and have free will and all the possible choices they could make, then you're basically observing an individual in a time stream with all these different possibilities. And so regardless of what we think, we have free choice, and we have, in the flow of time, that we can choose, when really that's not the case for someone who is outside of that system looking in at us. We think we have that ability, and we do have that free will, and free will is, of course, one of the basic building blocks of this book. But I guess from God's perspective, it would seem like we don't have that free will. Just as if we were to look at a 2D cartoon, we say, oh yeah, it doesn't have the ability to, think for itself or move towards us. It's stuck on that plane. It can still move left and right, but it can't move towards us on a z-axis. So it's a weird, free will is there and also isn't, because if you're an observer from such a higher dimension, it doesn't look like they have the free will that we would know it as, or the freedom of movement as we would know it as. They would seem confined. So just a little thought experiment there. And so on the second day, God makes the land and the waters. And it's interesting how he says, divide the waters from the waters. So some people have taken this to mean not only the waters as the oceans and the lakes and whatever, but also the atmospheres. That, there's an ionosphere, there's a stratosphere, etc., and different gases are like that. And again, to a creator-like being, that would just seem like all liquids. It's all same floating material and structure, and they're all layered on top of each other until you have the outer layers of the earth. And then on the third day, of course, I said he makes the sun and moon. And on the third day is when all of the trees and animals, all the trees and plants and fruit essentially are born and created and generated upon the earth. And so on the fifth day, God creates all the animals, including specifically whales. So, from big to small, all these animals are created, and he says, be fruitful and multiply. And he's made everything in the sea on the fifth day, and on the sixth day he made all the animals that go upon the land, including man and woman, male and female. And he basically says, go out, go forth, be fruitful, multiply. And I think this is actually an important passage, because on this sixth day he creates man. Yet in the next chapter he goes in more details about the first man he makes, which is Adam and Eve. And this is where things get a little bit head scratching, because later on in the story, Adam and Eve, obviously, they have descendants, and those descendants essentially mate with other people. And so people think, well, if they're the only people, then where did the other people come from? And, you know, are these, you know, the first special people or something? And so I've always said, or always thought, that on the sixth day when God created man, he created other people. And it's just that Adam and Eve were special people specifically placed in his Garden of Eden. So that's what I think explains the fact that there are just other people around, and people think that Adam and Eve are the only ones, or the first ones. Like, no, there are other people outside the Garden of Eden that they end up continuing the human race with, which to me makes sense. And of course, on the seventh day, God finally rests and becomes a holy day. One quick point I'd actually like to bring up with this, you know, again, we really do ride the line here between mythology, history, belief, you know, truth, essentially. One really good interpretation of this creation myth I would recommend is, well, actually, one really great movie, I think was by David Aronofsky, was the Tale of Noah. I think it was just called Noah. And, you know, I'm used to biblical movies being pretty garbage, but this one was actually pretty cool. It was actually like epic, and it showed the angels and giants and stuff. It was actually pretty cool. I'd recommend that. There's also a very famous GIF from that movie about all these warriors throwing their weapons throughout the centuries. There's a lot of really cool stuff in there, and I'd recommend it. But the other thing I would think specifically for the creation myth would be the final fight of Legend of Dragoon. I'm not sure people are expecting that, but when you're fighting the final boss, Mahu Frama or whatever, he turns into this final godlike form, and the whole thing, you know, in that is that there's this advanced race essentially that tries to stop another advanced race from being born because God basically commanded it and was in this like a sequence of creation. And so in that final fight with the final boss, it actually does a reinterpretation of all the stages of creation up until the sixth day, because the seventh day just rests, so nothing to show there. And I just recommend you look at it if you want a really cool interpretation of this opening story. But that is the very first chapter of the first book of the Bible. So congratulations, we got through it. And again, it's a very simple creation myth and a creation story. And there's some implications here that you can take. I know one thing is that God says here that man essentially has dominion over all of the beasts of the earth. So there's some animal rights argument in there, I'm sure. Or someone could argue, well, you know, man and woman were created along with nature and along all the beasts of the earth, so they're all equal, you could say. There's nothing. Anyway, there's a lot of interpretations you can bring from it, but that's kind of the basic creation myth. So the second chapter of this book, actually, funnily enough, the second chapter opens up with God resting on the seventh day. So actually it's finishing off from the first section, which is a weird choice, I guess, that they made to section those between. But anyway, after God finally rests, it goes into more detail about, and I think this is, yeah, and so it says, and then the Lord God did this. And I find it interesting because, again, it implies, you know, that whole theory about there being other people, there could have been other people besides Adam and Eve. Well, it's saying, and then, so it's a continuation. And yeah, so anyway, God in the second chapter basically goes and creates the Garden of Eden. And he puts the man and the woman in there. And first he goes into detail that he's making Adam. And so he says he forms him out of clay, I believe. No, out of dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living soul. And so this is very interesting that when it talks about Eden, it calls it, it says that the Lord God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put the man whom he had formed. And every time I read that, I just think of like an RTS, like he's like formed his land and he puts a special unit in his little base or something. Anyway, but what's interesting about this is the way it describes Eden is it actually gives it geographical locations and markers that it's at the intersection of the Euphrates, the Tigris, the Katamon, I think, and some other river. And so today, the Euphrates and the Tigris are still both real rivers, and they both exist. There's actually two intersections. One of them is in southern Iran, and the other one actually is in northern Iran. They're actually that long. And so, I mean, I've just done my own research into this, and the one that's more north, it's basically they intersect there, but it's just those two rivers. And the only other place where they intersect in the south, there's actually a third river meeting them there. And so, you could say that, if Eden was a real place, if you had to geographically locate or find Eden, it would be in that place in southern Iran. And what's very interesting is that historically, that area of southern Iran correlates to the city of Ur and the beginning of the Sumerian civilization. So there's a lot of interesting theories that are revealed from this. One of my favorite being the idea that this story about the Garden of Eden might have been a royal story or an earlier myth that was told to the royalty and or the children of the royalty of the kings of Babylon, which would have been, of Mesopotamia. That would be the very first civilization, and this was the main fairy tale that they created. And it would make sense too, because the most precious, amazing thing that you could find in a desert-like area are gardens and hanging gardens, and the design of Iranian architecture, fountains, streams, being pooled around, the architecture to cool off the house. There's a whole science to that, and introducing lush vegetation would also cool down the house. So it makes sense that that's one possible explanation for this theory. And I'm not really against the idea that there are other myths that have been inherited into the Bible, as if that's some, you're stealing or copying or basing off something else, or, but ultimately they've all been transformed and preserved. And despite of its original context and original meaning, it has a new meaning reincorporated into this book, and it has significance that way. So I don't really see an issue with that at all. But anyway, that's just something to bear in mind as we move forward. The river went out of Eden to water the garden, and from there was parted and became into four heads. Pison talks about the land of Havilah. Talks about the second river is Gihon, which goes into Ethiopia. The third river is Hiddekel, which goeth towards Assyria. And the fourth river is the Euphrates. And so it just says it goes into Eden, basically. I recall the Tigris being in here, but I guess that is not correct. And I know there are newer versions of the Bible, and the dialogue and the writing here might be a little bit intimidating for some people. But I'd encourage people to try to stick with the old stuff. At least I do. I try to stick with the original words, the original interpretations. The King James Bible is the most, or has become the most reliably deciphered text. I mean, when it was created, it was a public project by King James II in 1611, in which they had Greek, Hebrew, and Latin scholars all cross-referencing every copy of the Bible they had to make the one official lay English Bible. And so for better or for worse, this is the one that everyone has based the last 400 to 500 to 600 years of literature and interpretations on. So again, from a literary perspective, this is the most reliable source that I think we can use for understanding other people's references and ideas, which is, again, one of the main reasons I was reading this. And of course, God says, "It's not good the man should be alone. I will make him, and I shall make a help for him." And so and out of the ground of the Lord God formed every beast of the field and every fowl of the air. So again, it's saying that God's creating the animals, but he already did that in the previous chapter. So I think they separated these to show that this isn't something that is also just, now happening, but it's giving more context for things that happened prior. And so God makes all these animals and says it's Adam's job, his only job so far, to just name the animals. And the name, or the term Adam in the Hebrew, I believe, which is what this is written in, is, I believe it means red or ruddy or muddy. And that became also the basic word for man as well. So Adam gives names to all the cattle. The Lord God causes the sleep to fall upon Adam, and he slept. Then he took out one of his ribs, closed up the flesh instead thereof, and the rib which the Lord God had taken from the man, he made a woman, and brought her unto the man. And Adam said, now bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, she shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. I'm sure there's some Hebrew wordplay there. I don't get it, but that's where we get it. So this is interesting. He calls her woman, and I guess they haven't given her the names Adam and Eve yet. And then even here it says, therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. And they were both naked, and the man and the wife were not ashamed. So even here, God is giving, I guess you could say, his first piece of advice or law that, hey, if you get a wife, you can't live with your parents anymore, which is difficult for some people. Sorry, I had to take a break. My camera died. Anyway, chapter 3 of Genesis. This is when we're introduced to the serpent. And it's interesting in this chapter that you have to imagine that, first of all, the serpent is not the serpent as we know it today, because at the end of this chapter, God curses him to basically crawl on his belly and eat dirt for the rest of his days. And essentially that this creature beforehand looked like something else. And there's been a lot of very interesting depictions as to what the serpent possibly looked like. What's also very interesting is that the serpent as the devil, or as Satan, is not a relationship in this chapter. It's just an animal, essentially. And people made that inference later on. Another thing that's interesting is I noticed in certain European countries that the symbol of the serpent is sometimes very strongly associated with Christ himself. And that's a very paradoxical thing that by modern standards seems a juxtaposed symbol, essentially. And the reason that they thought this is that when a snake sheds its skin, it's like it's being reborn. So that idea of constantly being reborn and immortality actually went along with Christ quite a lot. And so in some circles, when you see a serpent associated with Christ, it's not referencing this story. It's actually referencing a more localized cultural animal stereotype associated with it. So I'll just add that. In this section, what occurs is that the serpent essentially tempts Eve, saying that you shall become as God, knowing the difference between good or evil if you eat the fruit from the tree in the center of the garden. And Eve is saying, oh no, he told us that, you know, we would die. And so the snake, it basically tempts Eve. And actually it's funny because her name isn't Eve yet. She's still just referred to as the woman, while in the previous chapter, I believe it's God names the first man Adam. And it's only until Eve gets her name at the end of this chapter from Adam. So what occurs is, of course, she eats the apple and she essentially gives it to Adam to eat because, you know, she wanted him to join her. It's funny that there are, just recently I was at an art gallery, and there's quite a lot of paintings depicting this scene, but in a very specific context where this one artist decided to depict the scene where the text itself says that Eve just gave Adam the apple, but it doesn't say if she deliberated or hesitated or weighed the options. But this one scene in this piece of art was depicting Eve getting Adam the apple as if she had thought about it and said, yeah, no, I should go with him anyway, or I should bring him into this mess I've made and do it. And it's an interesting, it can be a pretty interesting interpretation where between a thoughtless Eve that is scared and afraid and just gives it absent-mindedly to Adam, to a more sinister Eve who, after eating the fruit of knowledge of good or evil, decides to do something evil or liberating, or to introduce Adam into this, from his more naive, innocent state into this new world of hardship. At least she doesn't exactly know what's going to happen, but she knows there's going to be a punishment. And so, of course, that happens. And so they realize that immediately, that they are naked, and they realize that that is bad. And so they sew some fig leaves together. And this is interesting how it describes God in the scene where he's basically strolling or walking through the garden, and he's calling out Adam's name, saying, "Where art thou?" And Adam said, "Oh, I'm here, Lord, but I'm hiding." He's like, "Why are you hiding?" He says, "Because I realized I was naked." And God said, "Oh." And so, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because God made the system, he made all the animals, he made the serpent, and the serpent decided to subvert the one rule that God put in place. I mean, you can put the blame on Eve, you can put the blame on Adam even, but ultimately it's the serpent's fault, and God made the serpent. So, I don't know how you want to interpret that, but that's kind of a funny irony, I suppose. Anyway, so God says, okay, all right, the rule has been broken. Now there has to be essentially punishment, and there has to be consequences, or the rules have to be changed, however you want to say it. So the consequence is that, again, the snake is turned into a snake as we know it now. So it goes on the ground. I don't know, maybe it looked like a dinosaur or like a dragon or something, but now it goes on the ground and it slithers around. It eats dirt for the rest of its days, and it puts a enmity between the snake and the woman. For Eve's punishment, she is given pain in childbirth. She is forced to bear children, and her her basic reason that you will crave to cling to your husband, like he will be the one thing that you want, and that he will have power over you. So that's the beginning of the female condition. For the male condition, Adam's punishment is that he essentially, the ground will no longer yield fruit as it does in Eden. He will have to work tirelessly, day after day, week after week, tilling the ground. And it says, I actually missed this. This was really interesting, that the sweat of his brow shall be his bread, which is such a, that he basically, he's eating his sweat, that is his reward, which is just a brutal sentence. And so finally, they kind of realize that if they take the fruit from the tree of life, then they shall be like us forever. And so because of that, they send them out of Eden. God casts them out. And so two things that are super cool in this passage is, first of all, when he sends them out, he sends them out of Eden. I forget, I'm sure there's direction, east or west. But he says by the entrance to Eden, he places a cherubim with a flaming sword that points in all directions. Now, that is impossible and very cool. I mean, just in general, a flaming sword that is pointing in all directions sounds like some kind of, I don't know, laser beam or some kind of orb or some sort of shield of fire. But that's essentially what God creates. And it's a very cool mythological image, and I've always been so fascinated by it, and I can't think of any media in which I've seen that represented, maybe because it's simply so abstract. I mean, at most you probably a painting with an angel and like a white robe holding a flaming sword, but I think there's a lot of room for a really interesting interpretation of the Guardian of Eden. I think it would be really cool to look into. The second thing that, again, as the Bible changes, I was just reading this, that God says, I must cast them out of Eden unless they eat the tree of life, otherwise they shall become like me? No, like us. And again, you reread these passages and they have very interesting meanings and interpretations. What does God mean when he says us? Are there other gods? Is he referring to the angels? Is this similar to the Sumerian Anunnaki mythology, where their creation story had a multiplicity of gods, a sort of pantheon? But in any case, God says, they cannot become like us. And he doesn't refer who he's talking to. Maybe he's talking to the animals, I don't know. But the animals, I know, do the animals in Eden live forever? I don't know. But that's kind of chapter 3. Oh, right. And also at the end of this chapter, it says that Adam calls his wife's name Eve. Again, I don't know if there's a Hebrew, language significance to that word, other than this is the Eve of humanity as we know in the beginning, but there it is. Okay, so chapter 4 of Genesis, this is where things kind of get really started. And I think this one chapter is the parable of Cain and Abel. I think this is the most, you could argue, culturally relevant topic. And so after Adam and Eve leave the garden, they go east of the garden. And so they conceive, and it's interesting that this is our introduction to the first word or term for this relationship, is that Adam knew Eve. And this is the first time we see this term, which is that Adam knew Eve, or that knew his wife. And so through this, she gives birth to Cain. And then after Cain, she births Abel. So Cain is the firstborn, but he decides to become a tiller of the earth, a farmer, while Abel is a herder, and he tends to a flock of sheep, I believe. And so it's really interesting that we are introduced to sacrifices, and they're sacrificed unto the Lord. Now, later in the Old Testament, it gets very, very specific. How you sacrifice, how much you sacrifice, what's the right process, the procedure, on the days, all the rules around sacrifice. But this is our introduction to the concept of sacrifice in the Bible, and we aren't given any details. All we know is that Abel gives the firstborn of his flock, while Cain just gives some of his crops to God. And we don't know what they do with them, if they burn them or just give them to God or something, to show reverence. And so the Lord essentially looks on Cain's sacrifice and is displeased with it. He said it was not filled with respect. And so because of that, what occurs is, and it's like, was Cain supposed to give a better, the firstborn of his crop or something, or the best of his crop? It's not clear if it's because of the nature of the sacrifice, or if it's the nature of how Cain sacrifices, that he just really doesn't mean it, or he doesn't give the best of his crop to give to the Lord. In any case, it's interesting how, again, we have this very first sacrifice, and it's, the main sacrifice that pleases God is the best that someone can give, their firstborn. It's, the ultimate thing that Abel can give him. And so it pleases God. And so because of this, Cain becomes very jealous of his brother Abel. And so there's a line in there saying that if you don't sacrifice properly, or along those lines, then sin shall come lying at your door, and it shall come to tempt you with desires. And I find it so really absolutely interesting that a person who does not work hard and a person who does not sacrifice will be filled with desires. There's something very real about that I maybe should reflect on later. But anyway, that's the case. Anyway, we all know how the story goes, and it's very quick. It just says, Abel one day rose up to his brother in the field and struck him and killed him. And God comes to Cain one day and says, "Where is your brother?" And I think he says basically, oh, I don't know, I don't know where he is. But what happens is, of course, oh, I know where Abel is. You struck him down and killed him. And one of my favorite lines, your brother's blood seeps into the earth and it cries out from the earth. Just an absolutely fascinating, amazing prose. And so God is like, well, because of this, now your punishment is that as you roam the earth, it shall be even harder for you to till the land, and you shall be a vagabond and a criminal and an outlaw everywhere you go. And so this occurs, and apparently Cain complains to God, and he says, Lord, my burden is too much. In those places where I roam, they seek to kill me. And so God, I guess, because he still has affections for Cain or whatnot, he says, very well, those who seek to kill you shall be avenged sevenfold, the band, obviously. And you shall be marked with a mark somewhere to signify this curse or blessing upon you. So this is really interesting. I mean, I immediately think of things like Berserk, where you have a cursed symbol on the character to show that, yeah, they're cursed, but also don't mess with them. I think rudimentary tattoos are like a symbol of this, where, it's a sign of some kind of trauma that affected them. It makes them also look tough, but also is a warding spell, like, hey, don't mess with me or you will get in trouble, kind of thing, and to seal off the evil away from you. So a really interesting concept. And then we kind of start to get into the not so great stuff, where it's the genealogies. So it says Cain knew his wife, doesn't mention who it is, and it's not Eve, because Eve later, it talks about her. So Cain gives birth to Enoch, and then Enoch gives birth to someone else, and then it's Lamech and Jubal and like 5 or 6 other names that I don't care to recite because they don't do anything in the story. They're just there to show the process of time and the genealogies. And at the end of this chapter, it says that Adam came to know Eve again, and they gave birth to a son to replace Abel, who would be like Abel, and his name is Seth. And this is interesting, that Seth then procreates, and his son is named Enos, unlike Cain, who his son is Enoch. So that's kind of interesting. It's also really important to mention, I'll give you a bit of forward, that the genealogies might not exactly match up on a time span, because I'm pretty sure at the end of this, we're going to find out that Adam lived for about 900 years. So if it seems like they only had one child while these other people, Cain's family is having multiple children, then essentially it might not be on the same time frame. It might be hundreds of years that these people are living. On top of that, I forgot one thing, is that Lamech, I think Cain's great-great-grandson or something, basically said, surely if Cain would be avenged sevenfold, then we should be avenged 70 by sevenfold. So it's the idea that every one of Cain's descendants, they also can't be killed, or there will be divine vengeance on them, even more so than if Cain was killed. So that's kind of what they're thinking at this point. Right, so for the 5th chapter of Genesis, again, it just goes into the genealogy stuff. And this is where a lot of people's brains turn off. And I really don't blame them, because it's just a bunch of stuff just happens. So unless you have, I don't know, an idea for writing a book in your head and you want some cool character names, this stuff is great. But otherwise, it's not really super exciting. So I was right. So basically, it's really interesting here that when Seth is conceived, Adam, it says, was 130. And then it says all the days of Adam's life were 930 days. So Adam lives to almost 1,000, basically, which kind of shows you how you think about a life, or you think about the span of a day might not be the same amount of length of time that we think it is. So right here, it's another example of someone's life being almost 1,000 years long. and conceiving at 130. And then after Enos, there's multiple more descendants. And of course, the one that we're all kind of somewhat interested in, I feel, is it's Enos's, or Seth's great, I think like 7 generations great grandson, Enoch. So this is the Enoch where it says that Enoch walked with God, and then it just says that, for he was not, for God took him. So it's very weird because this entire genealogy, it's very straightforward. It's okay, Seth, conceived this child, then Seth died, and then, Seth's child, Enos, conceived then, and then this guy was born, and then this person died, and it's all a very straight genealogy. And just in the middle of it, it says, oh yeah, Enoch walked with God, and instead of dying, God just took him up to heaven. God just took him, just voided out. No clipped out of there, just no explanation. He didn't even say take him up to heaven. I've seen some people and some interpreters say take up to heaven, but I think Enoch, he just disappears. And I think he's the more interesting and esoteric character of the Bible, simply because there's so much stuff talked about him. He's the one of only, I would say, characters in biblical lore that is taken to heaven, who doesn't die. And it's very unusual, I would say. Of course, Enoch, what he's known for is the Gospel, or rather the Book of Enoch, which is part of the Apocrypha. It's a book that I think people consider it. It's not even Apocrypha, because it's one of these books that a lot of people allege was written much later, much after these books were written. Even at the Council of Nicaea, they're like, it was fanfic basically, and so for a multitude of reasons they just did not include it in the Bible. But I'm pretty sure it was discussed whether or not it should be included, but it was very obviously a later fabrication, as I understand it. So in any case, Enoch, like the entire story, the entire mysticism around this character is literally 2 lines saying that just God took him. Like, that is it. And that's been the speculation of many pieces of media and fiction, not to mention, El Shaddai Ascension of Metatron, a fabulous, fantastic Japanese video game where you play as the titular Enoch, whose job in that context is to essentially descend to Earth to fight the fallen angels and bring them back to heaven as criminals, which is friggin' just the coolest concept ever. And as a game itself, just the aesthetics of it are alone really, really fascinating and really cool and hyper abstract. I'd highly recommend it to anyone who's interested in this kind of stuff. But yeah, that's Enoch. That's all it is. And for the rest of this genealogy, it goes very, very simply, and then it just ends with the fact that Noah is born. And we get into chapter 6. The other thing I should mention is that as it's mentioning the genealogies, it's mentioning the births, the deaths, is that every single time someone dies after Adam, it's always a little bit less. So Adam dies at 930, then Enos is something like, 800, 700, 650, 600. So it's slowly coming down, as if their connection to the original creation is slowly degrading and degenerating with time, or maybe it's because there's just more people in the world and there's some life energy thing. Anyway, you see that concept come up a lot in other media, that when there's less people in the world, people live longer, or that there's a way to live longer by, essentially being closer to God, essentially. Just another thing I would note. All right, so Genesis chapter 6, and this is interesting too, that it says on the point about living longer, this is very cool, that says, "The Lord said, my spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120. So it's showing that there's something about God's spirit that actually makes people live longer. And God's like, yeah, I can't always do this, or I can't always abide with you for whatever reason. And then it talks about, this is really cool, that the sons of God, that they looked upon the women of men and fancied them. And so these angels essentially descend and they mate with, the women of men, and their offspring apparently makes these perpetually evil people. It says their minds were filled with evil thoughts continuously. And I just found this to be really, fascinating. And these are angels that we assume had bad intents, that betrayed God by breaking, some kind of covenant with him and breeding with the earthly woman. And they also talk about the fact that it says here, there were also giants in those days. And I was confused that the giants were conflated with the angels themselves or with the offspring, but it just says there were giants in those days. So I don't know if it's essentially related to that or maybe unrelated. In any case, the offspring of the angels and the human women are, they don't have a name, but in other lore, they're usually called Nephilim, and angels are usually called seraphim, which I believe are all Hebrew Jewish terms. So those aren't in here. They're just called angels and the offspring of angels and men. And so it says that the offspring were also old men of great renown. So all the legendary heroes like Hercules, Odin, Thor, Gilgamesh, kind of is implying that all these great men were descended from the copulation with these angels, and that also these men's minds were, not exactly them, but either these men or because of the acts of these men, it's not really clear, that for whatever reason, it says the imagination and the thoughts of mankind were filled with evil thoughts continuously. So essentially that there's no hope, there's no repentance, there's no sacrifice. Maybe we're also talking about the sons of Cain and their brood, but for whatever reason, all of humanity is just evil. They're wicked. There's just no hope for them. And they're continuously evil. There's no redemption there. They don't want to be saved and redeemed. And so God essentially is repentant and decides, all right, just nuke this whole thing. And he finds contrition, or he finds mercy in the eyes of Noah, who is, of course, of the line of his original creation, Adam and Eve. And so from his line, he finds mercy in them. And he says, okay, fine. And he says, for you guys, you'll build an ark, you'll build a safety place to be while I just decimate the earth, because everything is so corrupt and evil, but you are the only good thing that's left. And it's interesting that this is also the first time that we see the word covenant. You could argue that God makes a covenant with Adam, a promise that do not eat that fruit of the tree as the first covenant. And it basically is a covenant. It's basically just a pinky promise. But here is the very first time the word appears. I'm making a covenant with you directly, Noah, and to save you and your family and your 3 sons. And so it talks about Noah and his wife. I think she has a name later, but it talks about their 3 sons that are born, which are Japheth, Shem, and Ham. And of course, this is where the term Semite comes from. It actually is derived from Shem. And so if you're an anti-Semite, you're a anti or antagonist of essentially 1/3 of the population, because as we will see, they survive the world and they go off in their different directions and they repopulate the world. So it's kind of a very broad group of people essentially that Shem is derived from. And I won't get into spoilers, but we'll get to that part when we get there. And so, God basically, it's interesting that God, he gives Noah very direct instructions. He says, when you build this boat, it needs to be 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide. He actually gives measurements to Noah. I don't know if he's writing this down or just telling him directly, but this is another thing you'll see occur in other things where God gives very specific architectural instructions on how to make something. It's from God, so you assume it's going to be perfect, right? Unless you mess up somewhere. And it's interesting that this is the first time that God will give very specific instructions of this nature to build something. And we'll see this a lot again later when God gives specific instructions for things like the Ark of the Covenant, the tabernacle, the actual tent it's housed in. And again, it's highly specific things. And this is very interesting because the idea of a God-given architecture or a mathematical formula is kind of the founding principle of organizations like the Freemasons. This idea that they can build a perfect structure, or that through math and science that you can create something that is of a divine nature, that you could build something out of brick and stone and yet it has a spiritual nature to it. And that is part of the whole history of the architecture of churches in the East and the West. They have very different designs. In the East, for example, they really like large domes. The idea that the dome is the world, the firmament, and that it is reflective of a smaller interior world. And the idea that God will, of course, visit you and say hi if you build this structure correctly. While in the West, it was very much a more, I guess, vertical style architecture where the chapels and the cathedrals had spires that were all aiming towards godliness and God himself, in the idea that they're sending their thoughts and prayers to an unforeseen place, while in Eastern architecture, it's the idea that they're almost bringing God to them, rather than sending out signals and messages and hope, which is a very interesting philosophy just in the architecture of the churches, which is super cool. And of course, the Freemasons, they have their ceremonies and whatever, and there are some that are more esoteric and devious and very unreligious, masquerading as a pseudo-religion. But they still take in all of these ideas that they're able to build something according to a divine intellect that isn't their own. And again, that's really cool. That's also, the main drive of things like, the scientific revolution, the scientific method, the idea that there's a way to get the absolute perfect version of something, and to use science, math, and logic to create something that is of an otherworldly nature. And so, the rest of the story goes out how you know it. They build the ship out of something like gopher wood, whatever, and then they also put all animals of each sexes, male and female, on the boat and carry it off, essentially. And it's kind of brutal how it describes it, because it says the waters and the rains, it just rains for multiple days until it floods the whole earth. And we don't really think of water as a very evil element or thing, but it says the water shall come upon the earth and just destroy all flesh. It will just destroy everything in its path. And it's a pretty brutal way to do it, but it's just water. So, but it's how God decides to do. I mean, it's beyond genocide. It's just killing literally everything, every species, every person, besides what Noah and his wife and his family could put on the ark. And so chapter 7 of Genesis is, again, pretty straightforward. It rains for 40 days and 40 nights, and it just covers the earth for 150 days and just kills everything on top of it, except for Noah and the ark and his sons with their wives, which is interesting because in the movie Noah, I'm pretty sure it depicts one of the sons without a wife, I think Ham, and that's why he's sort of an antagonistic kind of character in that setting. There's also an interesting thing here that God makes a clarification where all the animals, or the clean animals and the fowls, shall be taken onto the ark 7 by 7 instead of 2 by 2. So all the unclean ones are 2 by 2, but all the clean ones, all the good ones apparently, are 7 by 7. So they have essentially a lot more healthy or clean animals, presumably for eating, I suppose, but it's not made clear. Okay, so chapter 8 of Genesis, essentially Noah and the ark, God sees that everything has been destroyed. He ceases the raining to cease, and essentially he, creates a wind to come over the earth and clears away the water, not immediately or entirely, but what does happen is that it begins to seep down, and so the ark comes to rest on a very specific mountain called Mount Ararat. And present-day Mount Ararat is located in the Caucasus mountain range, just north of Turkey, I believe. And of course, this is where the term Caucasian comes from, where the people there descended from the Caucasus and were apparently the restart or the reset of ancient civilization. It's also important to bring up the story of a flood myth is a universal story. You find in a lot of every ancient stories and religions. And so you can make the comment that, oh, well, they were all copying each other, or this is an inherited myth from some other religion or from other mythology, rather. Yet it is very, very interesting that almost every single major religion has a version of this flood myth, which does kind of attest to the idea that they couldn't possibly know each other, so they must be all referencing some major cataclysmic event. And you hear about these kinds of things in ancient history, like the Bronze Age collapse, the Sea Peoples, and this kind of thing. So I think it's interesting that this story about the flood myth is kind of a universal thing that kind of adds to its validity that it might have actually happened. Also, if you're really interested in this, there's a great anime movie called Spriggan, which takes up this very story, where I think in the 90s they also claimed that they found remains of the Ark and pieces of wood in the top of Mount Ararat that archaeologists had uncovered. So apparently that's real as well, and there's a movie based off it. Obviously, it's not a documentary. The anime movie is more so an action thriller, metaphysical thing or whatever. It's a very cool experience. And so they've come to rest on the mountain, but it seems like there's not still enough land elsewhere. And so in order for Noah to test this, he first sends out a raven. And so the raven flies to and fro, but it can't find any land to land on. And so the next thing he tries is he sends out a dove. And so he waits a little bit, and the dove ends up coming back with an olive branch in its mouth. And that implies that, oh, there's a tree somewhere, and that there is land, and that the time of the annihilation of the earth is over. And he sends it out, the dove, actually a third time, to the point where it doesn't actually come back. So it implies that, okay, it's settled down and it's safe to come out of the ark. And it's very interesting, I feel, because, of course, the image of a dove with an olive branch in its mouth, which is a universal symbol for peace, is actually a biblical symbol. And I had no idea that was the case, but yeah, it's derived from this story. So you see any peace organizations with a dove with an olive branch in its mouth, that is derived from this story. Beyond that, I think it's also a funny point to bring up that it does mention Noah's age at this time is that he's 600 years old. So, he's still got it, essentially. He's still building ships and saving himself and his family from total annihilation, which is pretty cool. And so basically once they realize that it's safe to come out, Noah unleashes all the animals and they all fly free and they all descend onto the land and they become fruitful and multiply. And Noah and his sons' wives all survive and come out onto the new land. And so in celebration, Noah essentially creates an altar and makes a sacrifice to the Lord. So again, this is the second time we see a sacrifice. This time it's with a proper altar. And you'll see the altars many times mentioned throughout the Old Testament. What's also interesting about this section, though, is the way it always describes this throughout the OT is so interesting that when he sacrifices one of the clean animals, the fowls or a clean beast, it creates a sweet savor onto the Lord. And so the Lord was pleased. And so because of this, the Lord decides to essentially, he makes a covenant and a promise to just never do this again. So he will never wipe out every living thing. He will never, destroy the earth. He will allow the seasons and the times of day and everything else to essentially continue. What's really interesting, though, is this last bit is that, he cursed Adam and he cursed Cain with continual problems with the ground, farming it, bringing forth food. And so he says he's done with that, for he says that from man's birth, the imaginings of his heart are evil. So that's a very interesting thing to say, that for God to kind of reconstruct and realign that all of man's imagination from his birth from now on are still evil, despite the fact that Noah was the only decent person. He still, I guess there's that still potentiality in it. What's also very, very interesting from this context is, of course, the character of Cain. And so it's implied in this that the whole world has been flooded and that Cain and all of his descendants have been destroyed. Now, what's very interesting about this is, of course, there's a lot of literature where it kind of raised the question, well, what if Cain somehow survived? And this is the substance of a lot of vampire myths, maybe more modern stuff, where they say, Cain, because of his weird marking, because of the weird curse upon him, that he had essentially special powers. And so a lot of the times they'll say things like, oh, the first vampire was Cain, or they're trying to resurrect Cain as some demigod or something like that. And so that all kind of comes from that idea that this flood happened, but somehow Cain's descendants survived, or one of them survived, despite this massive annihilation. So chapter 9 is just kind of a follow-up where God is specifying the covenant. And so it says that, yeah, okay, I'll never do this again. I'll never destroy the creatures. And he says, I want Noah, your sons, and your family to breed and multiply upon the earth. And so for Noah, he says, I make this covenant with you and with the creatures of the earth, saying that I promise I won't ever wipe you guys out again. So even God is like, okay, sorry to the animals as well. And it's interesting that he says, as a token of this covenant, I shall establish it as a bow in the sky, and it shall come from a cloud, and you shall know it to be my sign. So of course he's referring to the rainbow. So the rainbow, this is very interesting, as a symbol is this covenant with God and the earth that I won't genocide you guys again. And I believe the rainbow today is now a homosexual symbol for whatever reason, which again is based off an early 1900s rainbow flag from a Christian organization that was referencing this phenomena. So that's what the rainbow actually represents. It's not anything really that a modern sensibility would refer it to. It's traditionally and originally this sign between God and the earth that it's saying, look, I'm sorry I genocided you. I won't do it again. And you treat the animals nicely and whatever. So there it is. And so they go out and multiply and everything's good. And it basically says Noah settles down. And what do you do after you've survived an apocalypse? Well, apparently Noah, he plants a vineyard. He starts making wine. It's the first time wine's been mentioned in the Bible. In world history, I mean, it's the very first, thing, let's party afterwards. So he plants a vineyard. He gets a little bit too drunk. And so this is, I think, a part of the story that people don't really focus on, because it does not really make sense. Where Noah gets too drunk, he passes out and he is naked, essentially. And so of his 3 sons, Ham sees him and sees his nakedness, and he, I guess, doesn't do anything about it. But his 2 other brothers, Japheth and Shem, they take a blanket walking backwards and cover him. So I'm not exactly sure if it's implied that Ham was ridiculing him or mocking his father, but it seemed like he just saw his father's nakedness, and this leads to a catalyst where he becomes cursed. So it says specifically that Ham sees his father's nakedness and told his 2 other brothers without. And so then they go and cover him, and then it says that Noah awakes and he says he knows what his son had done. So I think the implication is that because Ham saw his father's nakedness and then didn't do anything about it, not only was it super embarrassing, but it's super disrespectful. But apparently the curse that Noah sends onto him is saying that Ham, and it specifies here that he shall be the father of Canaan, and his descendants shall be the Canaanites. And so he says, for your whatever you did, you will essentially be cursed. You shall be a servant to Shem, and Japheth shall grow large and live within Shem's tents, and you shall also serve him. So for this great disavowal or whatever, Ham is essentially cursed to serve his two other brothers and all of his descendants. And then they basically go their separate ways and propagate in different directions, and yeah. And so again, this is where we get the term Semites from. It should really be Shemites, but for whatever reason they dropped the H. For Japheth, it would be Japhites, and Ham would be Hamites. And this is the first time you see the ite root word used to specify a group of people, and it's something you kind of have to really get used to, because they just use it all the time throughout the Old Testament. And it just refers to a group of people that are descended from a particular person. So the Israelites are actually descended from a guy called Israel, and we're going to get to him later in the book, but that's kind of where this term comes from. And so chapter 10 of Genesis, again, is a bunch of genealogies. And these, again, really are boring. They're not interesting. But it is interesting to note here that it is very odd here that it talks about the descendants from Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And so Japheth's descendants, just to give you an idea of what this sounds like, it's the sons of Japheth, Gomer and Magog and Madai and Javan and Tubal and Meshech and Tiras, and the sons of Gomer, Ashkenaz and Riphath and Tog-Arma. So the only interesting there is that one of their descendants of Ashkenaz is descended from Japheth, who is not Shem. So Ashkenazi, you'd think the Ashkenaz guy would be descended from Shem, but apparently he's not here. And then it keeps on going on and like that. And then Ham, the sons of Ham are Cush, Mizraim, Phut, Canaan, etc., etc. And it says, from Cush begat Nimrod, and he began to be a mighty one in the earth. And that's the only thing it says about him. But it does link into, it's kind of the blur between ancient history and mythology. These ancient kings that we hear about, Clovis, King Arthur, whether or not they actually existed. I mean, obviously those examples are much more recent, but people like Gilgamesh, it's a border between, there probably might have been a guy like this, but he's kind of been mythologized and had legends told about him. So Nimrod is a son of Ham, Ashkenaz is a son of Japheth, and also Canaan is a son of Ham. And so I believe it says here somewhere that Ham went south, Japheth went west, and Shem went east. And the sons of Shem were Elam and Asher and Aphraxad and Lud and Aram. And the sons of Aram were Uz and Hol and Gether and Mash. And of Aphraxad was Salah, and Salah begat Eber, and Peleg and Joktan, and so on and so forth, as you know. So there's no other really interesting names. Oh wait, hold on. And Ophir and Havilah and Jobab and Joktan. They were the sons of Joktan. So yeah. So that's really all chapter 10 is. It's just more genealogy separating the different tribes, the different ites we're going to see throughout. I think one of them is the Amorites, which are from Ham, I believe, here, and they show up all the time in the New Testament. Amorites and Amalekites and all these other guys, you get really tired, well, used to hearing their names. And so chapter 11, of course, another great mythological story is the Tower of Babel. Well, it's a little bit interesting how it describes it. It says that people went into the land of Shinar, and they basically invented or figured out, to tempering bricks and creating bricks, and they started making a tower there to reach up to heaven. And so because they were all of one language and they all could get together and work together, apparently God said that, oh no, they will be able to do anything that they imagine. So because of this, I have to go there and confound their language. And so it doesn't explain how he does it or really why he does it. It just says, I don't want them to have unlimited potentiality. So he essentially confounds their language, and the people there essentially scatter and move away from this tower that they were building. And because of that, it was called Babel, which is interesting because it's called Babel after the fact. So what they were building could have been called something completely different. And of course, every language is corrupted now. So of course, the way they pronounce Babel in different languages is going to be different. They probably call it something else. I don't know. I'm reading way too much into this, but just for the fun and sport of it. But yeah, it's a very, very short, simple story. It's like only one paragraph long about this very, important aspect of biblical history, and doesn't really go into much more detail than that. Yeah, it says, God is worried that nothing will be restrained of them which they have imagined to do. Again, it's interesting here where it says, God says, let us go down and confound their language. So I assume he's talking to his other angels when he's doing this. I think it's funny here that it says, let us make a name for this place, lest we be scattered around the whole earth, which foreshadowing happens in about 2 sentences later. So I guess it was called Babel is what they called it at that point. And so it finishes that very brief story, and it immediately goes back into the genealogies of Shem. And so finally it gets to Abram and Haran, his brother, and more importantly, Haran's son, which is Lot. And Lot will appear later, but Lot is essentially Abram's nephew. And Abram is married to Sarai, and they essentially are a couple, but Sarai cannot get pregnant. So they, for whatever reason, they end up, they were living in Ur of the Chaldees, which I believe is, kind of the southern Iran, and they go into the land of Canaan, which is, I believe, to the west, or it would be west of there, closer to Egypt. So chapter 12 of Genesis is, again, a little bit of a weird one. So essentially, Abraham and Sarai are living with Haran in the west, and so God apparently calls out to Abraham. And so Abraham, Sarai, and Haran's son Lot decide to all pack up their stuff and all the resources, and they go west, even all the way onto Egypt. And it said that when they got there, in the land of Canaan, he made an altar unto the Lord, and the Lord appeared to him. So God shows up, and he basically says, this land shall be your land, you shall inherit it, it shall be for your ancestors and your inheritance, despite the fact there were Canaanites living there. And so he makes that covenant and that promise, and they continue even more westward all the way till Egypt. And when they came to that land, apparently there was a famine. And then as they're going towards Egypt, they're still going, I guess, it says that because Sarai was very fair and she was his wife, he said that she should cover herself and say that she is his sister so that they don't try to kill him and then take her for themselves, which is, I guess, the custom back then. So because she reveals herself to be a sister, it's not as much of a problem. Anyway, so they come upon the Egyptians, and apparently Pharaoh meets them, and they kind of greet them as foreign guests and lavish them with camels and maidservants and whatnot. And the Pharaoh kind of is, flirting with Sarai. And because of that, and for the sake of her sake, God apparently sends a curse on the Egyptians and the Pharaoh. And so it's revealed to Pharaoh later that, this is actually your wife. And he's very ardent. He says, why did you lie about this? Were you worried that I would kill you and take her for myself? And he says, essentially, be gone with you. I don't want anything to do with you. So I think it's funny, even in this very first part, we aren't even at the Joseph story yet, and the story of the Israelites breaking free of Egyptian exodus. But their very first encounter with the Egyptians are that they end up, having conflict. they end up hiding and disguising themselves, and they end up getting cursed and thrown out. So it's almost like a foreshadowing to what's about to happen. Chapter 13 is very kind of boring. Essentially, it specifies here that Abraham was very rich with cattle, and he was considered a rich man, a successful man. And so they go out of Egypt and they go into the south. And so Abraham sets up his cattle for herding, and Lot goes further south and sets up his cattle for herding. And so apparently they have their own shepherds or cattlemen, and essentially they get into conflicts, they get into some kind of dispute or something, and so Lot and Abram have to meet and kind of say, okay, well, this area is my area, this area is your area. And so Lot decides to take the place which is called Jordan, which is a modern day country still. So you'll find a lot of very interesting again, references to modern day terminology and references, and that's just another one where entire country is originally Lot's herding ground for his cattle and his sheep and whatever. And so Abram goes into the plain of Mamre, the land of Hebron, and that's where he settles down, and that's all that chapter is. And again, this is where the Lord, he builds an altar unto the Lord, and again the Lord tells him that this land, from the north, the east, and the south, all you can see shall be yours. And so chapter 14, essentially there's this great war between Sodom and Gomorrah lined together, and they're fighting this other empire, Amraphel, king of Shinar, Ariel, king of Elasar, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam. It goes on. It calls them the title kings, and there's all these names and places that you're never going to remember or be referenced later, so it doesn't really matter. But the thing is that Lot had settled near Sodom and Gomorrah in Jordan, I assume, where essentially there was this great battle. Sodom and Gomorrah lose, and their kings are slain, and a bunch of people are abducted, including Lot. And so Abram gets a bunch of his servants together, and they pursue and go after him and basically rescue Lot. And then there's this really interesting and enigmatic character and passage here that after they save him, and the king of Sodom went out to meet him after the return of the slaughter of Chedorlaomer, and the kings that were with him at the valley of Shaveh, which is the Kingsdale. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God, and he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram, for of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth. And so it's the first time we actually have a priest-like character. It's just been different guys making covenants with God, but we actually have a priest. And it's kind of weird because we're not sure what the proper religion is, if Judaism has even been invented or the Old Testament religion of any sort, but there is a priest here, some kind of holy man called Melchizedek, and he becomes a referential point later on in other studies and lore where it talks about Jesus's assertion to the high throne of a high priest, and some people reference Melchizedek that he was a non-Levite priest that was aligned with God and blesses Abram. And so chapter 15, before I actually get into that, it's important to recognize I forgot something to mention in the previous one, that the other people call Abram the Hebrew. And I was always really confused because I said, okay, how is he a Hebrew? Where does that name come from? And it goes all the way back to Eber, which was, I think, the fourth generation from Adam. And it's interesting that they mention that because, of course, Hebrew is a language. And so Hebrew, descending from Eber, it makes sense that language goes back that far. So it was established then, which kind of calls into question what kind of languages people would speak without any intercision, if they would even develop a language, and what Adam and Eve were speaking before Hebrew or even language was invented. Maybe they couldn't speak. It's an interesting question to pull up, but this basic building block is a reference there. So in chapter 15, so basically Abraham is questioning God. He's saying, okay, you've promised me that my seed shall be like the stars in heaven, that I shall inherit this land, but I'm not seeing it. And so Lord says, very well, the time has come. And he says, take a heifer of 3 years old, a she-goat of 3 years old, a ram of 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And he divides them all, except for the birds, and lays them down. And it says, this is really interesting, that the sun was going down, and it says, a great sleep came over Abram, and he has a vision of God speaking to him in his dream. And so in his dream, he kind of just says the same thing again. Yes, surely your seed shall be many, it shall inherit this land, and that the Amorites, for their time is coming. It is not now, but until their 4th generation, that their iniquity will be ready for their punishment. And so you're introduced to a few concepts and a few words here that are very biblical. First of all is iniquity, which is a really interesting word that is most similar to the word karma, i.e. that someone does something bad and then they have a punishment or recompense for it at some point. And this whole concept of the punishment of this people will not come directly to them for their wickedness, but to their 4th generation, is a really interesting reoccurring thing that you'll see, especially in the Old Testament, that God will not punish the person directly, but either their children or their children's children's children, which is a really odd way to go about it, but this is the Old Testament, so there it is. And so it says more specifically here that I made a covenant with Abram, saying, unto thy seed have I given the land, from the river of Egypt unto the great river, the river Euphrates, the Kenites, the Kezites, the Kadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Raphamites, Amorites, Canaanites, and Girgashites, and Jebusites. So he mentions a few geographical locations there, the Euphrates in Egypt, but mostly a bunch of tribes that are at the time inhabiting those areas. So this is the beginning of the promise of the land of Israel, or this land for Abram, but it doesn't really actually have a name yet, and we'll see that in the next chapter. So chapter 16 is our first drama chapter, where essentially because Sarai realizes she's still barren, she's so fed up with it that she goes to Abram and says, well, look, if I can't get pregnant, then can you try to conceive with our handmaiden? And so their handmaiden is an Egyptian woman called Hagar. And so he conceives and goes on to Hagar, and she ends up conceiving and it becomes pregnant. And so she gives birth, and before that, when Sarai realizes that she's become pregnant, she becomes very jealous, and she realizes she's made a mistake. And so she comes back to Abram and renounces her. And so Hagar, noticing and realizing that her mistress is upset with her, tries to flee, but the Lord tells her, or actually an angel of the Lord tells her, to go back, to return onto her mistress's hands. And so there they kind of reunite, and she gives birth to a boy, and his name is Ishmael. And Ishmael is saying that because of the trouble Hagar went through, he shall be a wild man, where he shall be at combat with every man, and every man shall be at his throat. So chapter 17, this is finally the point where Abram makes the covenant official with God. So essentially Abram turns 99 years old, and God appears to him and he walks with him, and he says, be thou perfect, I will make my covenant between me and thee, and multiply thee exceedingly. And Abram falls on his face, and God says, arise, no longer shall you be called Abram, but you shall be called Abraham. And no longer shall your wife be called Sarai, but she shall be called Sarah. And so it's interesting that with this covenant, they are given new names, and of course a new token of the covenant. This is my covenant which ye shall keep between me and you and thy seed after thee. Every man-child among you shall be circumcised, and ye shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be a token of the covenant betwixt me and you. And so and then that same day, he circumcises himself. He gets Ishmael, his son, who is 13 at the time, to circumcise himself. And he also circumcises all of his servants and all of the people in his family, in his house, and any relatives that are around. So all the men essentially have to circumcise themselves. And he says, truly will this happen? Will my wife, Sarah, truly bear a son when she is 90 and I am 99? And God says yes, and his name shall be Isaac, and from him shall come 12 princes, and from them shall come many kings that will rule the earth. And so chapter 18, what happens is that it says the Lord appears to Abraham along with 2 other angels essentially. But in front of Abraham, it seems like 3 men appear, and they come to his tent. And so they just come and they have this short conversation, and Abraham essentially says, oh yes, my wife will be pregnant soon. And Sarah laughs in disbelief to herself, saying, I'm an old woman, there's no way I could possibly conceive. And Abraham says something back, or saying, like, for anything for the Lord is easy if you only have faith in him, and so on and so forth. And so the angels, at this point, they are essentially eating with him, talking to him, and they point towards Sodom and Gomorrah. And the Lord in that form says to him, for this Sodom and Gomorrah's sin is very grave and very sinister, they should be destroyed. And so, this is God. I know he made a promise not to destroy the whole world, but he could at least destroy maybe a couple cities still. And so Abraham essentially talks to him, and he does this whole kind of negotiation with God. And it's very interesting how he talks him down from, well, if the whole city is evil, what if there's at least, 100 noble people? Would you still destroy it? And God says, well, no, I guess not. And he says, well, what about 50 moral people? And God says, yeah, no, there's 50 people, I wouldn't destroy it. And what if there's 20, 30, or 30, 20, 10, if there's at least 10 noble people, will you leave it? And God says, yeah, if there's like at least a few noble people in that city, then I won't destroy it. And because of course Abraham is thinking about his nephew Lot and his family who live there. And so the story goes from here about the 2 angels and how they essentially deal with Sodom and Gomorrah. It's funny though that I have seen this passage used as a gotcha for certain Christian trying to convert Jewish people or open their viewpoints, because this is used as a reference point that God has appeared specifically in a human form to people in the past. And their kind of angle is that, well, if God can appear in human form, it wouldn't be impossible for him to appear as Jesus Christ, for example. And but yeah, it's just a normal passage about God and a couple angels intervening in the guise of men. So chapter 19 of Genesis is a little bit spicy. So we kind of get the whole story of Sodom and Gomorrah in one kind of shot. So the 2 angels who decide to investigate the city of Sodom, they go in, and Lot is there at the city gates to greet them. And he says he bows down almost to the ground to meet them, which is interesting, almost like an Asian, Japanese style bow. Anyway, so he greets them saying, Lords, or travelers, come to my house, as guests. And so later that evening, a bunch of men come around the house knocking on his door saying, where are those 2 men that came in with you? Let us know them. And so Lot comes out of the house and he says to them, these are guests in my house, please don't know them. And then strangely, I guess, he says, instead I'll offer up my 2 daughters who neither know the touch of a man instead for you to have. So, the crowd says they wish to know these 2 men. And on a first reading, it seems kind of odd why they would demand that. And of course, with the added context of offering up his daughters in a certain manner, it's very obviously that Sodom was filled with sodomites, or people who enjoyed male-to-male relationships quite forcefully, as it seems. And so when Lot essentially says, no, you can't have them. He says, fine, if we can't deal with them, we'll deal with you. And so they have a scuffle at the door and they fight with him. And so the angels come out and they essentially blind the men near the front door and drive them off. And it's the next day where the angels wake up and they talk to Lot and says, look, you need to get your family out of the city. It is going to be destroyed. And so, fulfilling God's promise that he wouldn't destroy it as long as there were noble people there, they end up grabbing all their stuff, gathering their stuff, and leaving the city. And so it says God rains down fire and brimstone from heaven and destroys Sodom and Gomorrah. And of course, the famous scene where Lot's wife looks back in regret, thinking about her past life and whatever. She looks back at the giant explosion and the destruction, and she is turned into a pillar of salt. And therefore, after that, what happens is that they hide up in the mountains by the city of Zoar, and the two daughters of Lot, for whatever reason, figure and think and decide that there are no other men in the world, that was a total extinction level event. And so they say, in order to preserve our father's seed, they get him drunk and sleep with him for a few nights in a row. And so both of them become pregnant, and the elder born gives birth to Moab, who become the Moabites, and the younger born daughter gives birth to the Ben-Ami, who becomes the progenitor of the Ammonites. And it's interesting because the Moabites and the Ammonites are constant foes of the rest of the Old Testament. So it's interesting that they are products of essentially incest from this. So chapter 20, we return to Abraham, and essentially he's traveling through the southern country between Kadesh and Shur, and he goes into Gerar, and he comes upon this man called Abimelech, which it seems like he's staying with or sharing the land with. And so Abimelech comes to fancy his wife Sarah, and he becomes very close to her. And of course, for whatever reason, Abraham has decided to say that Sarah is actually his sister rather than his wife. And so God comes to Abimelech in his dream, and he tells him, hey, this guy is his wife, and for what you have done, there will be a great curse upon you, or there'll be great bad things against you. Even though he said he hadn't actually come on to her, but he was getting close to her. And so Abimelech awakes from his dream and recites it and says to Abraham, I had no idea, you should have told me. Why have you done this thing? And he says, for the trouble and for the curse, I'll pay you 1,000 talents of silver or something around there. And then after they had left, there was a curse removed from Abimelech's family that all the wombs of his house had opened up. So apparently the woman couldn't conceive while Sarah was, after he was going after Sarah. So in chapter 21, Sarah conceives and she gives birth to Isaac finally. So finally they have a son. But Sarah points out to Abraham that because there is Ishmael and Hagar in their house, it's going to be a constant rivalry, and she wants them gone basically because they will not take part in the inheritance of Abraham's descendants and his blessing. So basically she tells him to get rid of them and send them off, and Abraham is very grieved by this because he's still his son technically. And so God comes to him and says, do not be grieved, Abraham, for Ishmael shall also receive a nation of his own, because he is from your seed and your loins as well. So Abraham says, okay, all right. And then he gives Hagar and Ishmael bread and water and sends them on their way. And the only other thing that happens in this chapter is that Abimelech shows up again, and in that he addresses Abraham saying, will the Lord deal faithfully with me and truthfully with me? Can we make a covenant between each other based on that? And so Abraham goes to an altar, sacrifices an animal on it, and makes a covenant between him and Abimelech to deal truthfully. However, it does say here, it specifies that Abraham did resent Abimelech because what he had done is essentially stolen one of his wells away from him. So he kind of has a problem with this guy. And so in chapter 21, what occurs is the very famous story of the binding of Isaac. And so what occurs is that one day God comes to him and he tells him, okay, bring your son Isaac up into the mountain of Moriah and sacrifice him there. And it just says immediately after God tells him, he gets 2 of his servants, a donkey, his son, some wood for the sacrifice, a knife, and a bunch of other stuff, and they set off on their quest. Apparently it takes them quite a long time to get there, around 3 days or something. And then he tells the 2 servants to wait at the mountain. He says, I will go up with my boy and worship up there. And so he's going up the mountain, and he essentially makes the altar, puts the wood and the hay and all the fire stuff ready and starting, and he has the knife to slay his son, and the son says, Father, for where is the sacrifice? Where's the lamb for the sacrifice? Specifically a lamb. And Isaac, or rather Abraham says, God will provide a lamb for us. And so as he's about to set everything up, and as he's about to plunge the knife into his only son, that's when an angel of the Lord appears and says, stay your hand, Abraham, for you have proven your conviction and your worth and love in the Lord's sight. Instead, there shall be like another sacrifice. And what he finds is that there's a ram right there caught in the thickets that he sacrifices instead of his son. And so they descend from the mountain, and then there's like a little part here at the end where it's talking about Nahor and all the children that she's had and all their random genealogies that just appear apparently. But yeah, that's a very classic story. Again, it's only a few paragraphs long. And what's really interesting about this is, yes, there's an inspired video game based on this, which is very fun, but I don't think very relevant to this. But what's more interesting, actually, is the fact that this one short story was actually the basis for the very philosophical and fascinating work, one of my favorite works ever, actually, which is Fear and Trembling by Soren Kierkegaard. And Soren himself, I think he was the youngest of his father's children of a large family, and apparently he died in his 30s from some typhus or something, I don't know. But he wrote religious, philosophical literature. He's considered an Enlightenment thinker, even though he's compounding and encouraging Christian and religious ideas, but he's hyper focused on this one short story and really goes into the fear and the trembling and the faith. And the whole leap or step into faith is the cornerstone of how he sees his own faith. It's not just a Christ-like faith, it's an Isaac-like faith, or an Abraham-like faith, more accurately, because the whole context of the thing, they don't give you the internal mindset and emotions of the characters, but you can only imagine that Abraham has been promised this great empire or this great line of descendants that are going to outnumber the stars and the dust and sand on the earth. And his wife and him are both in their 90s, and it seems impossible that they can conceive, and it's only through a miracle of the Lord that they do have a son, Isaac. And it's a bit difficult, I think, also to imagine what age Isaac is at this point. It's very obvious that it seems like he can walk. Otherwise, it might mention Isaac trying to carry him up the mountain. So he's at least old enough to walk. So at the youngest, he could be 10. At the oldest, he could be maybe 20, possibly, or even older for that matter. But, you know, and the notion of his question, where is the lamb for the sacrifice? It sounds like a very innocent kind of question. So something, again, very childlike. He could actually even be younger, I suppose, maybe 7 at the youngest. And so you have to think about Abraham's perspective. It's only through, it's a miracle that Isaac even exists. And he's this, is his firstborn and only son. And he's cast out his other son at this point, Ishmael. So at this point, he is risking everything. He is risking it all based on the whim and instructions of God. And he doesn't argue with God like he did with Lot and the city of Sodom. He just does it. And it's the uncertainty that this is going to work, is that this is truly God's will, that there is fear and trembling in the uncertainty of faith, but it's almost through an overabundance of that fear and trembling. The hope and the idea of faith itself is this thing that overcomes fear and overcomes trembling and overcomes doubt, and is a thing and a light and a hope that supersedes all of that. And that's kind of Kierkegaard's main driving idea. And again, it's just a hyper focus and an analysis of this one short story that really connected with Soren. And there's plenty of other stories and spin-offs based off this story, and it's sometimes used as a critique of the religion, because they say, oh, this is such a messed up story. And it is. It's a very intense experience. And if you take it as just a baseline, oh, well, you shouldn't do that, that's wrong, you're kind of missing the point of the process that these characters have to go through and what they have to feel and what is required and asked of them, and the fact he was almost about to go through with it until an angel interceded. So there's a lot to interpret just from this one alone. Just like the Giants or the Garden of Eden, this one chapter has its own sub-meta analysis associated with it. So there it is. But Isaac's story is not done, as we will soon see. Chapter 23, not much happens. Sarah unfortunately passes away at the age of 127. And so when they go to bury her, apparently Abraham goes to secure a specific place to bury her. And so he goes to this guy called Ephron, the son of Zohar, and they basically bargain or talk about what he wants, and if it's, how much, and 400 shekels of silver or whatever. So this is an introduction of currency, which in this case are shekels. And so he basically buys it for, I think, 400 silver shekels. And this is essentially the cave of the patriarchs, along with this land in which the in the plains of Mamre, where apparently I believe this is still a modern day site called the Cave of the Patriarchs, where Muslims, Christians, Jews, it took me so long to think of that, would go there and worship and visit it as a very holy place, because this is the patriarch of the patriarch. I mean, technically everyone can, I guess, claim descendant to Adam, but the first kind of recognizable historical real-ish figure is Abraham, and he's seen as the descendant of all the main religions and something more akin and close to a historical person rather than Adam, who might as well be mythological since it's so far back in the past. So in chapter 24 is the romance of Rebecca. So it opens up with the fact that, Sarah has died, Abraham is very old, and he becomes kind of ill. And so he goes to his master servant, who strangely throughout the entirety of the story is never named, and he goes to him and asks him, so essentially, I need you to swear an oath to me to take these jewels and our gems and our finest clothes and go and find a wife for my son. And he said, I need you to not find a wife or a woman from this area in the land of Canaan, but you must go to my home country in Mesopotamia and find a woman from there. And so it makes sense why in the previous chapter it was recounting the genealogies of Melchiah and Nahor, because Rebecca is actually a great granddaughter of Abraham's brother. So it's kind of like a cousin thing, but it's pretty removed, I guess. And so what's interesting about this, though, is when he's swearing this covenant to him, he asks the servant to put his hand under his thigh as a sign of trust when making this promise. And that might not seem significant, but I bring it up because later in this story, there's going to be another covenant, a very important covenant, where the left thigh is also brought into play as a very important part of the body, and will essentially come up again. So anyway, the servant sets out. He goes into the land of Mesopotamia with jewels and silver and treasure and whatnot, and servants. And so the servant comes upon women at the water who are cleaning clothes and gathering water for the town, and they have their water jugs on their back or their head or doing whatever. And so he notices a fair damsel, a virgin named Rebecca. And he notices she's very fair. And so he goes up to her and says, girl, would you go down to the water and fetch me a jar of water? And she says, oh yeah, sure, no problem. And she goes down and she comes back. And so for her trouble, he gives her, I think, a gold earring or 2 gold earrings and gold bracelets. And he puts it on her ears and on her hands. And so they essentially come, says, I need to, ask you about, this proposition to come marry Isaac. And so he says, and she says, well, okay, we'll go back to my house. And so he enters the house and he meets her brother, Laban. And Laban, I'm pretty sure, takes another role later on in the story. And so Laban basically asks and inquires what this servant is doing here, what are his intentions, and so he has to recount the whole story. And it's actually funny because rereading this is one of the few times in the Bible where, again, like the Bible is very succinct in a lot of its information when it's going over this kind of stuff. It's almost too detailed in some cases where it's telling you stuff you don't care to know. But it's the one instance where when he's asked to recount his things and the events that brought him here, he doesn't just have like a fade to black moment where he's like, oh yeah, and he recounted the thing. No, he literally, the author goes through rewriting all the events that brought him there, including coming there and asking her and going to fetch the water and putting the ears on her. So they repeat that whole story again just for the sake of Laban, as if he's listening. And then it continues saying that saying, I'm a servant of Abraham, and like, oh right, we know Abraham, we know he's a relative of ours, a distant relative, and it seems like obviously he has this treasure, he must be in a good spot, and we're so glad he has a son. And so they kind of deliberate, and so they say, well, okay, I suppose we would allow you to take Rebecca to be wed to this Isaac. And they said, but could she tarry with us just only 10 days? And so the servant says, because he feels compelled by God that his path would be impeded or jeopardized otherwise, he said, no, I'd like to leave sooner than later. And so they go to Rebecca and they say to her, what do you want to do? And she says, I would like to go and meet this Isaac now. And so he gets a fine raiment, puts her in beautiful clothes and jewels and golden things, puts her on the animal that they rode in there, and they come back and they bring her before Isaac, and she comes to him in his tent at night, and they become one. And it ends with saying that Isaac was now comforted for the loss of his mother. And that's that chapter. So I mean, that's one way to find a girl, I suppose. So in chapter 25 we finally get the things that happen next. And unfortunately next, of course, Abraham, he passes away, and it says he was the age of 175, or 115 years. This is the first thing I learned while reading the Bible, is what is a score, like Abraham Lincoln, whatever he said. A score is actually a farmer's term to refer to about 20 cows. So whenever you see 4 it would mean that would be 80, so 20 times 4. And it's just a very weird way of counting or naming things, but that's what we have. So anyway, Abraham finally dies at 175. He's buried again in the cave of Machpelah, again, the same cave where Sarah was buried, and the plot of land he bought. And at this point, apparently, before Abraham died, he also took another wife called Keturah, and they had about 5 children together. And so he said that eventually, after a time, the sons of his concubines he sent away, while he kept Isaac with him. And so after all this transpires and Abraham dies, finally, when Isaac is 40 years old, at that point, Rebekah has become pregnant with 2 children, which again leads you to question exactly how old Isaac was during his not sacrifice. But in any case, Rebekah becomes pregnant with twins, and the Lord says, "For surely there are 2 nations within you." And so she gives birth to the first one, called Esau, who is called as red as a garment from, I believe, his hair. And the other one, who's gripping his heel, is called Jacob. And I'm pretty sure Esau means red in Hebrew, or I wouldn't be surprised if it does mean that. And so they now have 2 sons, and Isaac prefers Esau because he's a strong and bold hunter, but Rebekah prefers Jacob, the technically second-born, because he is much wiser and cunning. And so what happens is, one day, Esau and Jacob are out in the field, and Jacob is making a pottage of lentils. And Esau has come home from some hunt with some animal with him. Or I'm not sure if he actually caught an animal. But anyway, he comes home and he's hungry, he's starving. And he says, "Brother, give me some of your lentil pottage. I should be forever grateful." And Jacob was like, "No way. I'm not giving you this. I will give you this if you rescind your birthright." And Esau says, "What are you talking about? I don't care about my birthright, just give me the pottage." He says, "Nope, you got to rescind your birthright and give it to me." And Esau basically says, "What good shall my birthright do if I am starving? Give this to me today in this hour." And says, you're gonna have my cursed birthright, or a pointless birthright." And he says, "Fine," and he gives them the pottage. So already we're introduced to these 2 new characters, and there's already a conflict occurring between them, which is very interesting, as we will see. What's interesting also, as I'm reminded of this, later in the book, I was very confused where there's a class of people who are descendants of Esau, but instead of being called Esauites or something, they're called Edomites. And it's the same people essentially, and they're all red-haired people from the Middle East. And for some reason, they changed their name. They went from Esau to Edom at some point. So just bear that in mind. So in chapter 26, we return to Isaac and his life. And essentially what occurs is that he goes about into the land of Abimelech. And again, they pull off the same old trick where, because he knows his wife is very fair, he says that she is his sister and not actually his wife. And when they find out about this, they're again infuriating, saying, "For it shall be easy for us to go after her if she was..." No, it's actually, I think I'm finally getting this after the 3rd time of them pulling this stunt. It's essentially saying that by saying it's his sister, that they all advance on her. And when they tell her and reveal to them that it's his wife, they all feel ashamed and guilty because of it. And they feel like they've intruded upon a marriage and a relationship that they weren't supposed to do. And he says, "Why did you do this?" So that you would stay away. So instead of doing the opposite and covering her up, I guess the psychology here is that because by saying it's his sister, they're pressed upon him. And when he stands up and reveals that it's his wife, then they feel ashamed of themselves and back off. So I guess that's one way to do it, I suppose. Anyway, so Isaac comes into this land and he begins farming, and saying through the Lord's help, he increases his crop 100-fold, and he becomes very wealthy and very powerful. And the Philistines get very jealous of him. And it's interesting how they're beginning now to introduce and differentiate the Philistines from the Canaanites. So Canaan is a large land, essentially the Middle East. And in that land, there are many different tribes and peoples. And it seems that the Philistines are a certain type of people in the land of Canaan. But the land of Canaan also encompasses Isaac and his family and others as well. So, and the Philistines are going to, just spoiler warning, they're going to become the main villains of at least the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. They are just constantly the bad guys, actually of the most of the Old Testament, to be frank. So eventually the Philistines get so jealous that Abimelech comes to him and says, look, you should depart from us because you are just too good and we're getting like envious of you. We don't want you around here. And so Isaac departs from them, and then he starts building a series of wells. And it's kind of implied that each well that he gives a name, like Sheba in the land of Beersheba, each one of these wells is still around and active to this day. In fact, I did see a documentary once where there's this well that was being used in the middle of the desert, and someone said, yeah, this is apparently, allegedly, one of the L's that one of the patriarchs that Abraham or Isaac built. And it goes back that far, allegedly. So that's why I think that's significant and why they're talking about it here, why these are important places. In any case, there's a bit more of a conflict between Isaac's men and the men of the Philistines who want to use these wells, and they have some disagreements. And so he finally meets with Abimelech, and they resolve their differences, and they make a new covenant between each other, and they have peace with one another, and he sends them off on his journey. And so that happens. And then the end of this chapter, it ends with the actions of Esau. And so Esau has taken apparently 2 wives, one of them being Judith, and the other one being Bashmath, of the daughter of Elon. Both of them are being Hittites at that time. So essentially meaning that I believe the Hittites are a type of Philistine who lived in that land, and essentially that they were not of Isaac's and Abraham's lineage and genealogy. And said this was, actually I want to get the exact wording here. This was a grief onto the mind of Isaac and Rebekah. So their oldest son is dating 2 girls that they really don't approve of. Chapter 27 is actually really interesting because it's, I think, a lesser known story of the Bible that still feels very mythological and very archetypical in a certain sense. So essentially what happens is that Isaac is old in age. He's now, nearing a normal living span, I suppose. And he says his eyes are very poor and he cannot see. And he says, let Esau come in, my firstborn son, so that I may give my blessing onto him. And so he says, son, before I bless you, bring me the savory venison, which I love to eat, so that after I've eaten, I will give you the blessing. And so Esau leaves and goes out to do hunting for venison. While he leaves, Rebekah realizes that he's about to give the birthright to Esau that she does not approve of. And so instead, she gets Jacob to pose as Esau and deceive his own father into receiving the blessing. And the way she does it is, he says, obviously I don't have any venison. And he says, Esau is a very hairy man and I am very smooth. And so Rebekah says, fear not, I will take the goat skins to put over your arms and neck so that you may feel hairy, but your father cannot see you. He says, well, what of the meat? He says, I have also goat meat to give him instead. So he comes in front of him and says, here I am, father, your firstborn Esau. And the father says, no, truly, he's not sure. He's judging him. Let me feel your hands. He says, okay, yeah, they're hairy. It is Esau. And he says, how did you find the venison so quickly? And so Jacob says, oh, well, it was the Lord God who brought it to me, for, he guided my hand or something. And it says, okay, all right. And so after he's eaten the food, he goes to Jacob and he gives him the blessing. And the blessing is reciting things like, may the field grow fat and the earth give unto you many good things. May animals fall by your might. May your enemies and those who hate you be destroyed. And may those who love you be rejoiced in your presence and whatnot. And so he gives the blessing. And he goes out of the presence of his father. And so then Esau shows up very quickly, not a moment too soon, or well, a little bit later. And he says, Father, I've returned with the venison. And he says, who are you? And he says, I'm your son, Esau. And then he realizes in a great cry that he had been deceived and he had given it to Jacob. And Esau was like, oh, well, okay, like, calm down. Like, he gives out a bitter cry, like, surely, can you not also give a blessing to me? Is there nothing left for you to bless me with? And for whatever reason, Isaac says that, I have already blessed your brother, and for you, your blessing is that you shall be a nation that lives and dies by the sword and a servant to your brother. And there's something about Jacob usurping or supplanting Esau, and it seems to be, again, like another pun or meaning in the Hebrew language, because when Jacob was born, he had his hand around Esau's ankle. So there's something about his name that means supplanting or overthrowing or subverting, I guess. And so from this, Esau is wrathful at Jacob. He says, how could you have done this? I'm mad, right? And so Rebecca, he actually tells this to Rebecca. He says, I can't believe he's done this. And so Rebecca, their mother, she goes to Jacob and says, go from this place, free from this place. Otherwise, your brother's anger will be kindled against you and he will kill you. And so she says, go to Laban, who is, Isaac or Abraham's relative, and her brother in Mesopotamia, so that he may escape his brother until he calms down and then he can return. But she says, I am so tired, essentially, that your brother deals with the daughters of Heth, and that he colludes with the people who are of a distant character or or like not good people, essentially. And so here she doesn't call them Hittites or Philistines, but the daughters of Heth, which I guess might be the matriarchal lineage of the Hittite people. But okay, chapter 28. Not much happens here, except for one big mythological aspect. So essentially, Jacob departs from the land. He goes back to the, to Laban, essentially. Meanwhile, Esau, even though he already has two wives, he says he also goes onto the wives of the descendants of Ishmael. And so he now is dating I guess he's dating his cousins, technically. So they're the descendants of, his father's other mother. And so he mixes upon with them. Jacob, meanwhile, he's journeying, going through the countryside, and he comes upon this one specific spot where there are a bunch of stones. And so he takes a few of these special stones and he uses it as a pillow, and he falls asleep as the sun sets. And this is where he has a dream about a ladder, commonly referred to as Jacob's ladder. And so his dream is that he has a ladder extending from the earth unto heaven, with angels going up and going down, and then God appears at the top of the ladder and speaks down to Jacob. And he says to him that essentially that all the stuff we've all heard before, that I shall multiply thy seed, I shall give you this land, and I shall keep you safe as long as you follow me and the commandments I give you. And so Jacob awakes in kind of a cold sweat, and he realizes that this place where he had this dream is a special place. And so he takes a bunch of rocks, and what he does is he pours oil upon it, and he anoints that place as Bethel. So a lot of the times you'll see them pouring oil on something, and the act of pouring oil on something means anointed. We kind of think that's a very special, sacred thing, but it's really just pouring oil on something with religious significance. I mean, technically when you pour oil into your pan, you're anointing the pan with olive oil so that you can have a nice chicken or something. But that's really all it means. But it has a more spiritual significance in this case. And so that is, I mean, that's really just the story of Jacob's Ladder. The one thing people will refer to or think of is, of course, there's a movie from the 90s, I believe, called Jacob's Ladder of the same name, where it's it's very different. It's about this guy who is a Vietnam vet who lives in New York, and he starts hallucinating and seeing weird images of his uncompressed or unprocessed trauma. And it feels like he goes into these hell dimensions inside New York City. I mean, New York is a hell dimension already, kind of, you could joke, but it's a very interesting movie and very influential. And the kind of the twist at the end is that he was dead the whole time, or he's just stuck in purgatory, which happens to be New York City instead of like Lost or something. And so it's interesting because that movie is used as the basis for the Silent Hill team, and or Team Silent, I think they're called, and their Silent Hill games from 1, 2, and 3, which I found super interesting. That movie, which I wouldn't really consider a horror movie, it's more of a thriller, became the basis for their study and utilization of creating Silent Hill. And this all ties back to this one passage. But as to the relationship between this dream and the segment in the movie, I honestly don't see a lot of similarities, other than this guy has a religious dream about his destiny and he decides to make that place a special place. Okay, so now we get to another kind of romance part. So Jacob finally arrives at Laban's farm or his homestead or whatever. They're talking about Laban and he meets the servants of Laban. They're talking about Laban and his family and one of his daughters, which is, there are two daughters. There is Leah and Rachel. And so he basically meets one of the daughters, the younger one, Rachel, and essentially it says that he kisses her and he weeps and he rejoices and he, meets Laban, and he essentially, Laban says, "Oh, we've missed you, for surely you were blood of my blood, bone of my bone. Come on in, your family." And he says, "Very well, so you have come here to find a wife, as Isaac once did your father. And he basically says, 'For what fee shall I give one of my daughters to you?' And so he basically says, 'I shall work for thee.' And so, very well, he says, 'For 7 years I shall give you one of my daughters.' So for 7 years of labor, I guess, he'll give one of his daughters to wed. And so it says that while Leah was very doe-eyed, Rachel was beautiful and well-favored. So he was immediately attracted to Rachel, and he says, 'Very well, I will do so for Rachel.' And so, as I understand it, he does 7 years of labor, and he comes to be married to Rachel through her, and also her handmaid, brings her to him and everything. And I guess it's kind of confusing as to how it's arranged, because the bridal gown or whatever must be very, very heavy and intricate and designed, because in the morning when he reveals who he has made love to and conceived with, it was Lee, not Rachel. And so he's confounded, and he comes to Laban. He's like, "How can you have done this to me? You gave me the wrong woman, and I slept with her and consummated the marriage without knowing who she was," which is kind of, I don't know, ridiculous, I guess, to us. And so Laban says, "Well, technically it's a custom in our, civilization or in our tribe that we always marry off the first daughter." And he says, "Well, what about Rachel? She's the one I want." He's like, "Well, I guess you're gonna do another 7 years of hard labor," which he does. And so Jacob does another 7 years and gets Rachel. And so he loves Rachel far more than he loves Lee. or Leah. It's Leah. I'm not sure how to just probably Lee. And so once they have that scenario, and Lee sees that her husband favors Rachel much more than her, and that she is unfavored, God in response closes up Rachel's womb, and only Lee conceives for a while. So Lee conceives 4 children, which are Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. And then it says she leaves breeding, or conceiving rather. Okay, so chapter 30 is kind of a continuation of the last chapter. So while Leah has given birth to about 4 children, Rachel is so jealous over this that what she does in a weird... So Rachel gets Bilhah to give birth to Dan and Naphtali. And so Lee sees this and she's infuriated as well. And so she gets the same idea. So she gets her handmaid Zilpah to give birth to Gad and Asher. And so this is just pregnancy wars at this point. And then later on, there's this other story about mandrakes in the field, and they're picking them. And Rachel says something really kind of nasty to Lee, where she says, "Are you happy you've taken my husband from me?" And I don't, like, the Real Housewives of ancient Israel. And so I'm not exactly sure what the inferences of the mandrakes that they make someone fertile, but Lee says, "Surely I'll find favor for the Lord, and you know what? I'm going to conceive even more." And she does. She ends up conceiving with Jacob, Issachar, Zerubbabel, and Dinah, who is the only girl so far. And throughout this whole process, God finally kind of takes mercy on Rachel. He realizes how sore and heartbroken she is. And so finally Rachel actually conceives, and she gives birth to Joseph. And that's kind of the end of all the birth and the birthing. Jacob is, I think, excessively tired at this point. So we kind of got through all that. And the important part of why I'm saying all their names, so usually I don't go into the genealogies because I know you probably don't care, and I don't really super care. However, there are all the names I've mentioned, all of the sons between Lee and the maidservants and Rachel are all very important. The last one, Joseph, being the most important out of all of them. But it's important to keep in mind, because of these 12 men, more or less, as we'll soon see, they will establish these tribes. And from these tribes, almost all the main characters of the rest of the Old Testament trace their lineage back to these people. So the sons of Reuben are Reubenites, Simeonites, etc. So that's why I do bring them up, and I do go through these names very importantly, because they do come up later, and it's important to remember who these people are now, so you were like, oh right, that person is descended from that person, and so on. It's also important to notice that I'm skipping over it, but every time a child is born, she said, oh, because she had joy when he was born, they called him Asher. So again, there's some linguistic Hebrew thing with happiness and Asher in their language. I guess Asher sounds like happiness, and Gad and Dan and all these other names. So all that being said, that's that section. And the last section here is about resolving the dispute between Jacob and Laban. So it hasn't been the most trustworthy relationship. And it's interesting, it's hard to put this on the timeline somewhere, but Jacob basically says to Laban, look, I want to take my wife, my kids, my stuff, my cattle and livestock, and go back to where we came from, into the west in Canaan. And so Laban is like, oh, well, you kind of have to keep working. You still owe me. There's still work to be done. So I'm not sure if this is when he's still working with or for his wives and his 7 years of labor. But Jacob basically comes to Laban and says, look, I'll cut you a deal. What if you let me go now or early, You let me, instead of taking all of my own cattle, I take all of our cattle that I've been taking care of and laboring for, and I'll take all the ones that are spotted. So that's white spots on the goats, brown spots on the sheep. And the implication of that deal is that these are all the kind of not very healthy animals. These are the animals that might have diseases with them. And so Laban says, all right, you have a deal. You can take all the spotted animals and go. And as it describes that over the course of this time, or near the end of it, I think it was over a course of time, because what it says Jacob doing is that whenever a strong animal or healthy animal was born, what he did is he had these certain reeds, green, popular, of the hazel and chestnut tree, pilled white strakes in them and made white appear, which was on the rods. So whenever the animals went to graze at the watering hole, he made sure that all the strong ones were grazing at these specific plants that would make them spotted. When a strong calf or a strong goat was healthy and strong and well born, he made sure that it was born in the field with these white strakes, or the spotting or spotted plants that would make them spotted, so that the healthy ones appeared weak and the weak appeared healthy. And that's how he kind of did these switcheroo on Laban. So in chapter 31, what occurs is that Jacob essentially in secret gathers all of his stuff, his wives, and they take all of their, like a lot of their father's stuff with them, and they basically all flee on horseback with his children, and they all go, across the land, where they come to a place called Gilead. And so at this point, they alarm and alert Laban that he is left with all the speckled cattle and all this other stuff. And so Laban basically pursues him for 3 days. So Laban catches up to them, he meets them, and so Jacob talks to him, and angels appear in both their dreams. The angel appears in Jacob's dream, apparently tell him to do the spotted, calf thing, which I guess was in the past. And the angel also appears to Laban, telling him, do not speak neither good or bad, but speak well with Jacob, kind of thing. And so they finally meet, and Laban says, why did you flee? And Jacob says, well, I worked 7 years for one daughter, 7 years for another daughter, and 6 years for your cattle, while you changed my wages 10 times, and you abused me and whatever. And so Laban basically says, I think that these are my daughters and my children, my cattle. But somehow he comes to this realization that he says, very well, I'll let you go, but you must break bread with me and make a promise to me that you will never harm my daughters, and you will never take new wives besides them. And so Jacob agrees to the deal. They have food, they eat, and they make a covenant, and they go on their way. Okay, chapter 32. This is very important. So Jacob has resolved that conflict, but now as he goes further west into the land of Canaan, he hears word of Esau riding towards him with 400 armed men. So he's been away from his family for almost 20 years now, and so he fears that Esau rides now on his word to kill him and his family. So in response, Jacob gets a servant, says, take 200 she-goats, ride to go meet Esau, and give them to him as a present of peace and prosperity and whatever. And he says, and also take my family and go in a safer, different direction across the brook Jabbok. And so he puts his 11, his 12 children on the backs of camels and his 2 wives, and he says goodbye to them. And so he stands in this place called Peniel, and the sun basically goes down, and he's left in the dark all alone. And this is where a very important scene happens, where in this darkness and in the uncertainty of waiting to meet his potential demise at the hands of his own brother and 400 armed men, he is instead assaulted by a man in the darkness. And apparently there's this man who wrestles with Jacob, and he wrestles with him until the breaking of the dawn, until the morning light. And the way that Jacob gets the upper hand on this guy is he grabs him by the inner thigh and, I guess, wrestles him to the ground. And the man says to him, for who art thou? And he says, my name is Jacob. And Jacob says to him, I will not let thee go until you have blessed me. And so this is what this man says. And he said, thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel. For as a prince hast thou power with God, and with men hast prevailed. And Jacob asked him and said, tell me, I pray thee, thy name. And he said, wherefore is it that thou dost ask my name? And he blessed him there. And Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. And then it goes on to say why ever since that day they don't eat the shank or the inner thigh of certain animals because of this, which is super important, I'm sure. But this is a major part in the Bible that I had no idea about. I had no concept, no cognition of this, that Jacob wrestles with God. I don't know if you want to imagine that being God or Jesus in the dark, but he wrestles with God and he overcomes him and triumphs. And through this process of wrestling with God, he is renamed to Israel. So there's a lot of very interesting passages and tangents that you can pull from this. First of all, there's a lot of passages that talk about wrestling with God, wrestling with one's faith. And, it's a perfect metaphor and analogy for the fact that Jacob is waiting for what he thinks is his demise. He is wrestling with hope, with faith, with truth. He's saying, am I going to die tomorrow? And the despair, this is very similar to the Garden of Gethsemane scene, where he is struggling with his destiny, his duty, his life, his entire purpose. But he's literally wrestling with God. And that becomes more of a metaphor and a common phrase that people use quite a lot, where they're wrestling with their identity and their faith. And the second thing that's really important to take from this is that Israel is a new name for a prince who has faced God, who has faced all the odds essentially and has endured great hardship. This also implies, and will be the case, that from now on, all of Jacob's descendants will not be called something like Jacobites, but they will be called Israelites, because he is now Israel. And so as we can see from the previous chapter, going through those genealogies, Dan, Asher, Naphtali, etc., these are all the 12 tribes of Israel. This is who they are referring to, these 12 people. And so that sets up perfectly the framework for the rest of the Old Testament and the lineages. So chapter 33, the follow-up, Esau finally appears. It also mentions that his family is also in the scene, so his 2 wives and his children, so I guess they're also there somehow, or they've come back, or they were, taken by Esau. Anyway, Esau comes up to Jacob, and the first thing he does is he embraces him and kisses him, and he says, I've missed you all these years. Where have you been? And so Jacob's concerns about him being slain by his jealous brother are completely unfounded. And he says, oh yeah, no, it's good to see you too. And he says, this is my family, this is my cattle, whatever. And so Esau says, it's good to see you, basically, and he just kind of, says, all right, I'll be, kind of on my way. And so from that, Jacob goes, he buys a parcel of land, an acre of land, and he builds a an altar there called El Elohe Israel, and I mean, that's it. So crisis averted, I suppose. So in chapter 34, what happens is the land that they bought from a man named Hamor, his son Shechem, he essentially sees the daughter Dinah working in the fields one time, and so he comes upon her and defiles her right there. And afterwards he speaks kindly to her and he asks her, "You are so beautiful, won't you be my wife?" After he defiled her. And so he goes to his father Hamor and he asks him, "Oh, please get me this wife, or this girl to be my wife who I just defiled." And so Hamor goes to Jacob, or Israel, to tell him of it. And he says, "Oh, my son, fancies your daughter. He would love to marry her." And so Jacob, or Israel, and his sons, they're all abhorred by what has transpired and the fact that they still think it's okay to act like this. So they initially act deceitfully and say, "Yes, we will help you, but if you want to have our daughter's hand, you must become like us. You must circumcise not only yourself, but your son and all the men in your little village," or whatever. They actually call it a city, but it's I'm not sure how big it could be. But anyway, so they kind of agree. They do the stunt, and all the men circumcise themselves. And so on the second or third day, while they're still sore from their circumcision, Israel goes to his sons and tells them now is the time. And so Simeon and Levi take swords and they go into the city and slay every male inhabitant. And they take their stuff, they take their animals, and they take their wives, and they execute retribution on these people that thought it was normal to act like that. Again, it's kind of a weird thing to say how big the city was and how many men they killed, because it's only two of his sons that are actually killing all the men. So take that as it is. But yeah, that's what happens to Dinah, unfortunately. So chapter 35, God comes to Jacob again, and he reminds him, or he tells him to go visit his brother Esau, and reminds him of some weird things like, don't fall into the habit of worshiping the other gods, keep your clothes clean, take care of your family, all this stuff. And so he's sojourning to go meet Esau, and they come across Bethel again. And this is just some random stuff happens. For example, their nurse, or Rebecca's nurse, Deborah, dies. It's like, okay, we didn't even know that was a person. So she passes away and she's buried there at Bethel. Also, Rachel actually goes into labor again, and she gives birth to Benjamin. And the birth is so intensive and the labor is so disruptive that Rachel actually dies while giving birth to Benjamin, the last son of the family. The only other thing that majorly happens is that Isaac passes away at the age of 180, and he's also buried. Also, something I forgot in the previous chapter, again, God reiterates at Bethel that Jacob is now Israel. He's either reminding him or making it official. So Israel is now his true identity. Chapter 36 is pointless. It is a bunch of the genealogies of Esau, and it makes it clear 3 times that Esau, who was also known as Edom, and it just lists all of his descendants in chapter 36. That's all it is. So if you ever need to look up an Edomite in your area or find an Edomite name, chapter 36 is where you go. But otherwise, it's pointless. Chapter 37, though, begins the beginning of the new classic story that's going to be the entire next book of the Bible. So in his old age, essentially, Joseph becomes the favorite son of Israel. He's his favorite son because it was Rachel's only son, besides Benjamin, but it says he's 17 years old, and he's the youngest besides Benjamin. And so for whatever reason, Israel shows favor to his son Joseph, and so to honor him, he gives him a coat of many colors. And Joseph also further goes on to tell his brothers of his dreams, saying, "Oh, I dreamed we were tilling wheat in the fields, and my sheaf arose, and your sheaves bowed down to mine." And they say, "Uh-huh." And then he has another dream where the sun, the moon, and all the stars bowed down before him and were part of his Onisions. And so they say, uh-huh. So he's giving all these revelations and these things that his brothers shall be his servants and that he shall be the greater of all of them despite being one of the youngest. So obviously they really don't like him, and they basically get into a plot to kill their own brother because they just can't stand him. And he's 17 years old, but I mean, it's kind of extreme, but that's what they plot. And so they kind of say, oh, we should do this, we should kill him, we should bring him out into the wilderness and let a wild beast devour him so we don't have to kill him ourselves. And Reuben, the oldest, says, don't lay a hand on our youngest brother. So he's very eldest brother material, where he says, no, don't do anything stupid like that, just stop it. He says, at the very least, put him in a pit somewhere and let us forget about him if you must conspire to kill this boy. And so they do that. They put him in a pit in the wilderness, and as they're doing so, a bunch of Ishmaelite merchants are passing by. And so the fourth-born Judah has the idea, what shall it profit us to spill our brother's blood and conceal it? Let us not sell him off to a merchant so that he may be out of our concern. And so that's exactly what they do. So they pull him out of the pit, they sell him to the merchants for 20 pieces of silver. So, reminds you of another Judas in the Bible who did something similar. And what occurs is then Reuben apparently comes back. Apparently he was not part of this, and he rends his clothes saying, what has happened to the boy? And he's like, we sold him. And so he's like, fine. In order to make it better to father that he does not know what you have done, we have to devise a plan. So what they do is they take a goat, they slay it, and they dip his special coat of many colors in the goat's blood to show to the father and say that a wild beast of unknown origin has devoured Joseph and he is no more. And Israel is sore and cries hard and wears sackcloth upon his loins. It's a weird ritual you'll see a lot in the Bible, but whenever someone's mourning, they put sackcloth upon their loins. I don't know why. I guess it's very uncomfortable, but if that's how you mourn, that's how you mourn. And what happens to Joseph, though, is the merchants travel far and wide, and they sell him to Potiphar, the captain of the guards at the palace in Egypt, to the Pharaoh. So chapter 38 is a total departure, and it's specifically about Judah, the fourth-born, who tried to sell his brother to the merchants. So get ready for this family drama. So Judah marries a Canaanite woman called Shua, and they give birth to a son called Er, Onan, and Selah. So they have 3 boys. Now Er goes and marries a woman called Tamar. And this is where things get complicated. I forget exactly why here. It just says was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord slew him. So this is the sniper chapter for me. God is just taking people out with a giant sniper. It says the Lord killed him. Was wicked, he was evil, so he just got killed. Then, because he died, Judah said to his second-born son, Onan, okay, go into your brother's wife, Tamar, and you can have her. And then because Onan didn't want to mix his seed with his brother's or whatever, he implicitly spilt it on the ground, and because of that, God also killed him. So a lot of drama happens. And then fearing that his third son should be killed, he decides not to give him to Tamar. And he decides instead to have his third son, Selah, just stay at home, stay at the house. And so he still lives with Tamar, his daughter-in-law, technically, now divorced. Then what happens is that Tamar decides to take off her widow gown and put on these other risque clothes while also concealing her identity. So Judah is going along the road and he meets Tamar in disguise and takes her to be a harlot. And he makes a deal to sleep with her. And in those days, apparently the custom was that as principal, he would lend her his signet and his bracelets, and she would give it to another woman who would keep it for him while he went to the place and laid with her. And as he laid with her, he also conceived in his daughter-in-law without knowing. And so Tamar became pregnant. Then she left and went away from him, and she took his signet and his bracelets. And so when he came to collect them, they were gone. And so he was filled with fury, and he went to the local tavern or the bar of the town or something. And he said, "Where was this harlot that, is around these parts?" And they said, "There is no harlot in these parts." And so he's really now upset. He says, "Fine, it's better that, that harlot keeps them." Then he comes home and he catches word later that Tamar has become pregnant through whoredom. And he says, "We should burn her at the stake." And then only until he finds out that he was the one that actually conceived within her does he kind of say, "Oh, okay, you know what, this is my punishment." He says, it's a roundabout. He says, "This is my punishment for not giving my third son to you," and not, I don't know. I really don't know. And then what happens is Tamar gives birth to two sons, Zerah and Pharez. So, okay. So anyway, in chapter 39, we go back to Joseph's story. So he is now a servant in the palace of the Pharaoh, and he finds great favor with all of the patrons and the Pharaoh himself, and he's such a good servant that the Pharaoh makes him overseer of the palace. So he's kind of the top guy, he can, mingle with everyone, and what happens is the Pharaoh's wife falls madly in love with Joseph, and she keeps tempting him to sleep with her. And Joseph every time says, no, I can't do that. You are my boss's wife. I'm not doing that. It's also a sin in front of God. I'm just not going to ever do that. And so she tempts him, and there's one day when there are no men, no guards in the palace, and she comes up to him and she rips him by his clothes and saying, "Please, sleep with me." And in his fear and his exasperation, Joseph just runs from her while she has a piece of his garment with her. And so she calls out to the guards saying that he tried to force himself on her, and says, "This Hebrew has tried to force himself on me. Guards, capture him," or whatever, and turning it around. And so Pharaoh hears of this, and he's become wrathful with Jacob, and he says, "Off to the prison with you." And so Joseph is now thrown into the Egyptian prison. So chapter 40. So finally we're getting rolling on Joseph's story here. So while in prison, and it doesn't give a reason for this, I reread this, but for whatever reason, the Pharaoh became very wroth and very angry with his chief baker and his chief butler. And for whatever reason, he throws them in prison with Jacob. And so while they're talking in prison, they tell Joseph why they're there, and they also say, "We also have had these dreams and we can't understand them." And so this is a very interesting component. And Joseph says, "Well, aren't the interpretation of dreams the domain of God?" Which is a recurring thing, because his father, Joseph Israel, also had the dream of Jacob's ladder. So the butler tells him, "I have a dream where there's a vine in front of me, and there's 3 grapes, and it's blossomed, and the 3 grapes burst forth, and Pharaoh's cup is filled." And Joseph says to him, "It means that in 3 days, surely Pharaoh will come to you and restore you to your position." The baker says, "In my dream, I have baked meats which I have made for Pharaoh in a basket on my head, and there are birds flying around, but they do not eat them." And Joseph says, the interpretation of this dream is that in 3 days, Pharaoh will come for you and release you, but he will hang you from a tree, and the birds will feast on your flesh. And lo and behold, 3 days later, it's Pharaoh's birthday, and he restores the butler to his position, and he hangs the baker. And while Joseph finished giving this prophecy in the prison, he says, if this comes true, please do not forget me. But it says the butler forgot him. That literally, he didn't forget him, he forgot him, G-A-T. So, yeah. So in chapter 41, what happens is that the Pharaoh, 2 years have passed, and the Pharaoh suddenly starts having these dreams. First, he dreams of the Nile, or the river, and 7 fat, healthy cows come out of the river, and then they are followed on the other side by 7 unhealthy, ill-looking cows. And he wakes up in a cold sweat, and he doesn't know what it means. Then he has another dream the next night where there are 7 healthy ears of corn, and to his other side there are 7 ill, decayed, rotten ears of corn. And they're very vivid dreams. And so he wakes up and he asks his butler, do you know of anyone that can understand dreams? I've been having these dreams. And the butler says to him, oh wait, I've remembered that there is a Hebrew in our prison who is an interpreter of dreams, and he foretold my release. And so the Pharaoh says, oh, okay, let's talk to him. And so Joseph stands before the king, or the Pharaoh, and he gives an interpretation saying that these 7 healthy cows and the 7 healthy ears of corn represent 7 years of bountiful harvest. But those 7 years of harvest will be followed by 7 years of drought and famine. And then he gives a whole list of things to do, saying in the 5th part of Egypt, consolidate the food, have the people give extra grain and fill the silos, or the granaries with extra grain, so that we may resist and withstand the 7 years of famine with the 7 good years, and stockpile our food. And so he gives this interpretation, and everyone is so amazed from this one and the prophecy of the butler that immediately Pharaoh says, you are truly a governor, you are forgiven. And he gives him his ring, which is a sign of power. He dresses him in fancy raiments and clothing and a gold chain, and he rides with him in his carriage. And he is beyond satisfied with the interpretation of this dream. And he says, if only there were so many people like you who could have the Spirit of God. And so what he does then is he gives him engagement to Asenath, who is a daughter of one of the priests of Egypt. And together Joseph and Asenath have 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And these are kind of the last ones of the tribes of Israel. And Manasseh shows up here and there, but Ephraim shows up a lot. And in fact, the line of Ephraim is some of the most important characters in the Bible. So I'll keep that in mind. So what happens in the next chapter, 42, because there is indeed a famine in the land, Joseph sends some of his sons to go and buy corn from Egypt, because while Egypt stockpiled their food, they're now selling to everyone and becoming incredibly wealthy. So when they come to buy corn, Joseph recognizes some of his brothers. And so what he does to them in this thing, he wants to fulfill the prophecy of his dream. So he accuses them of being spies. And he says, truly, if you are not spies, and of course they deny him, let one of your brothers stay here. I will give you your corn. But if you want to receive your brother, one of you must be chosen to kind of stay here and return, and I will. And he says, I want you to return with everyone and your father, so that you may be vindicated, not as spies. And so Simeon volunteers to stay behind in bondage while they go back to their father. And so they go back to their father, and they have their corn, and they're sorely frightened of what they've been accused of. Chapter 43, not much really happens, honestly. It's just they resolve to go into Egypt and bring Benjamin with them, and Israel says, if I am bereaved of my children, then I am bereaved of my children. He just kind of accepts it. And it's a bunch of stuff about just meeting the Egyptians and their different customs, and the fact that the Egyptians think it's an abomination to eat bread with the Hebrews for whatever reason, and just nothing really happens, so we'll just jump to the next one. So in chapter 44, it's kind of implied that at the end of the last chapter, it says Benjamin had the biggest mess to clean up, and I'm kind of slightly confused on what it is, but it seems like they're cleaning up. They've put all their stuff away from eating with the Egyptians, and they leave, they go on their travels, and they're caught up with, and they're basically told, did you steal a silver cup? Or there's something about the corn money that they have, but they're basically saying whoever has, it's like, oh, of course, we didn't steal anything, we didn't do anything. And they said, if that's really true, then whoever, open your sacks, and whoever has a silver cup, he shall be a traitor and a liar, and he will have to pay a fine and will be a bondman to the Egyptians. And so they empty all their sacks, and it turns out the silver cup is in Benjamin's sack, the youngest, who had the biggest mess, who must have picked it up by accident. And so they all rend their clothes in, despair, and they are escorted into Egypt under the guise that Benjamin shall be a slave of the Egyptians, essentially. And they get there, and who is there to greet them but Joseph, who of course they don't recognize because it's been many years since that time. And so finally they kind of come to Joseph, and a lot of the chapters is pleading with him, saying, we'll do anything, we'll give one of our servants in place of Benjamin, please don't take our youngest child away, otherwise our father Israel will be sorely hurt by that. So immediately, chapter 45, Joseph can no longer contain himself, and he essentially falls on his knees and cries and says, it's me, Joseph. And they're weirded out. They're like, what are you talking about? It's like, it's me, Joseph, the one you sold into slavery. I was sold to the Egyptians, and now I am the master of this place. And so he embraces them, he kisses them, and they all kind of have a reunion, and it's a famous scene, and even this pleases the Pharaoh that he's so gentle and sensitive with his family, and it's a miraculous kind of event. And he says, go now to my father in his land and tell him that I am yet still alive, and the ruler or co-ruler of Egypt. And so they go back to Israel, and they tell him what has transpired, and he almost faints from disbelief. And when he sees the wagons loaded with treasures and corn and money, he revives and says, it is more than enough that my son Joseph is alive, and he goes to Egypt. So in chapter 46, it's really nothing. It's a bunch of genealogies of the brothers once they had settled in Egypt, and it talks about where certain, Judah and Simeon, where they landed in the land of Goshen, and they did shepherding basically in the land, and that's just all that is, and a lot of genealogies. Chapter 47 is interesting, where even though the famine, they've kind of prevailed against it, it says that their money failed, so they literally ran out of money to give people to buy things. They ran out of money in the economy, or it failed somehow. So then they started buying cattle for bread. They started selling bread for cattle, and then people got so desperate they started selling their land. And so Pharaoh, on behalf, with Joseph, bought all the land in Egypt and consolidated everything. And that became like the final kind of big purchase. And finally, the last thing is that Israel, at the age of 140, passes away, and his last request is to be buried with his forefathers in the Cave of the Patriarchs.
And so with chapter 48, you essentially have Israel giving the last blessing, both hands on Ephraim and Manasseh, saying that Ephraim would be greater than his brother, and basically that blessing and reiterating the covenant. In chapter 49, you basically have Joseph going over all of the sons of his brothers and his father, and saying each one what his destiny and his tribe will be and what they'll do. And they basically calls them the 12 tribes of Israel right there. And in chapter 50 is when Israel finally passes away. He recites all of these things back to Pharaoh. And finally, Joseph himself passes away at 110, recounting the generations of his two sons, saying that they will reside in Egypt, and it shall be a land, and Canaan, the land which they shall be theirs according to the prophecy. And that is the book of Genesis. It was a lot, and I don't know if I'll go into as much detail as the other ones, but I'm glad I could do it here in the garden for you all, and this will be an ongoing series, but right now, my camera's about to die, so I think that's enough. I hope you enjoyed, and as always, keep reading.